Congratulations, my curious friends, because in tonight's mystery, we present the ghost ship Mary Celeste, an American merchant ship found adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, fully intact but eerily abandoned, its crew gone without a trace and no sign of struggle. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers, and tonight, you'll hear it all. Now, lie back, listen closely, and drift off as the mystery unfolds. You've probably heard the name whispered in documentaries or stumbled across it in some late-night internet rabbit hole, the Mary Celeste. The name Mary Celeste resonates effortlessly, doesn't it? However, this evening, as you find comfort in your preferred chair with perhaps a cup of tea cooling on the side table, let us embark on a journey into one of the ocean's most captivating mysteries. Picture yourself on December 5th, 1872, somewhere between Portugal and the Azores. The Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, looking like rumpled blue silk under a winter sky. You're aboard the Dei Gratia, and frankly, it's been a rather boring voyage so far. Captain David Morehouse has been grumbling about the weather, the crew's been playing cards with increasing desperation, and you've read the same book 3 times. This kind of tedium makes you appreciate the fact that Netflix has not yet been invented. Then something catches your eye on the horizon. The ship is in motion, resembling an inebriated individual struggling to maintain a straight path. Her sails are set oddly, flapping in ways that would make any sailor wince. It's the maritime equivalent of watching someone wear a shirt inside out, technically functional, but obviously wrong. As you draw closer, you realize the problem isn't just poor seamanship. This is the Mary Celeste, a merchant brigantine that should be sailing purposefully toward Italy with a cargo hold full of denatured alcohol. Instead, she's drifting like a lost shopping cart in a parking lot, responding to wind and current with the enthusiasm of someone who's given up on GPS. Captain Morehouse knows this ship. He had dinner with Captain Benjamin Briggs just days before both vessels left New York. They'd shared stories, complained about the price of good rope, and probably argued about whether the weather would hold. Now here's Briggs's ship, sailing herself like some maritime autopilot experiment gone wrong. The boarding party you join moves carefully across the gangplank. There's something unsettling about stepping onto a ship that should have people but doesn't. It resembles entering a home where the coffee pot remains warm, yet no one responds to your calls. The deck is wet, but not from rain, from waves that have been washing over her bow unchecked. Below deck, the mystery deepens in ways that would make Agatha Christie jealous. The cargo is mostly intact, though some barrels of alcohol have leaked, creating a smell that's part industrial accident, part questionable cocktail party. Personal belongings are scattered, but not ransacked. It's as if everyone simply decided to step out for a moment and forgot to come back. The captain's cabin tells a particularly odd story. Charts are rolled neatly. The logbook sits open to an entry from November 25th, 10 days ago, recording their position near Santa Maria Island. The captain's wife's sewing kit is open, needle still threaded, as if she'd paused mid-stitch to answer a door that never opened. There's a half-finished letter on the desk, the ink not even fully dry, stopping mid-sentence like a conversation interrupted by something urgent. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. There's no sign of struggle, no evidence of piracy, and no indication of panic. The ship's papers are missing, which is odd because pirates typically care more about cargo than paperwork. The single lifeboat is gone, but the davits that held it show signs of hasty but deliberate lowering, not desperate cutting. You find yourself standing in the galley, looking at a pot of porridge that's gone cold and moldy. Someone had been cooking breakfast. Someone had been planning to eat it. Someone had been living their perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when something happened that made them leave everything behind. Let's discuss the folks who should have been aboard, because understanding who disappeared makes the mystery feel less like a ghost story and more like a very strange human drama. Captain Benjamin Briggs wasn't some mysterious figure. He was a seasoned mariner from a family of seafaring people, the kind of man who probably knew more knots than your average Boy Scout leader and could predict weather by sniffing the air. Briggs had brought his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia on this voyage. This wasn't unusual for merchant captains of the era. Ships were often floating family homes, especially on longer journeys. Sarah was an experienced sailor's wife who could probably splice rope better than most landlubbers and certainly knew her way around a ship's galley. Little Sophia, according to letters Sarah had written to relatives, was just beginning to walk and had apparently developed a toddler's fascination with trying to eat everything she found on deck. The crew was small but competent, 7 men who'd signed on for what should have been a routine voyage to Genoa. First mate Albert Richardson was German-born but had been sailing American ships for years. The cook, Edward Head, was apparently notorious for his creative interpretations of salt pork recipes, though whether his fame was in a good way or bad way depends on which maritime memoir you believe. The curious thing about this particular group is how ordinary they were. No mysterious passengers with shady pasts, no crew members fleeing from the law, and no cargo that might attract pirates or government agents. Just a family and some working sailors transporting industrial alcohol from New York to Italy, the 1872 equivalent of hauling cleaning supplies across the country. But as you explore their abandoned quarters, you start to notice the small details that make them human. Sarah's dress is laid out neatly on the bed, as if she planned to wear it the next day. There's a child's toy tucked under a blanket in the corner, a small wooden horse with wheels, the kind any father might whittle during evening watches. In the crew's quarters, you find letters from home, some in German, others in broken English, all expressing the universal homesickness of people far from familiar places. The ship's manifest tells you they'd loaded 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol in New York. This wasn't drinking alcohol, it was industrial stuff, poisonous if consumed, used for manufacturing, the kind of cargo that was valuable but not particularly exciting to anyone except accountants and factory owners. Hardly the sort of thing that inspires dramatic mutinies or attracts colourful pirates. What strikes you most is how the personal items are arranged. If there had been panic, you'd expect chaos. If there had been pirates, you'd expect theft. Instead, everything suggests people who left with intention, but also with haste. Sarah's jewelry is still in its box, but her coat is missing from its hook. The ship's chronometer is gone, essential for navigation, but other valuable instruments remain. Standing in the captain's quarters, you can almost imagine the conversation that might have preceded their departure. Perhaps Briggs noticed something troubling about the cargo. The fumes could be dangerous on a wooden ship. Perhaps he noticed an approaching storm that concerned him. Perhaps little Sophia had come down with something and needed immediate attention that couldn't wait for port. The last entry in the ship's log, written in Briggs's careful handwriting, simply notes their position and the weather conditions. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. These are merely the routine observations of a professional mariner performing his duties. It's the maritime equivalent of someone's last text message being about grocery lists, perfectly mundane until you realize it's the last thing they ever wrote. You find yourself wondering about their last meal together, their last normal moment before whatever happened. Did little Sophia play with her wooden horse that morning? Did Sarah finish mending whatever she'd been sewing? Did Captain Briggs look at his charts and feel confident about the day ahead? Now comes the fun part, the part where everyone becomes a detective and the theories multiply like rabbits in a particularly fertile meadow. Over the years, people have proposed explanations for the Mary Celeste's empty state that range from plausible to wonderfully ridiculous, and honestly, some of the ridiculous ones are more entertaining than most television shows. Let's start with the piracy theory, because it's the most obvious and also the most problematic. Pirates in 1872 were generally practical business people. They wanted cargo, money, and anything else they could sell quickly. They weren't particularly interested in kidnapping entire families and crews for no apparent reason, especially when said families included a 2-year-old who would presumably require constant attention and contribute nothing to piratical enterprises. Furthermore, the Mary Celeste's cargo was still largely intact, which suggests either the world's most polite pirates or perhaps no pirates at all. The mutiny theory has similar problems. Typically, mistreatment, underpayment, or truly awful conditions lead to mutinies among crews. Captain Briggs, by all accounts, was a decent employer who paid fair wages and didn't run his ship like a floating prison. His crew had signed on willingly and had no particular reason to revolt. even if they had mutinied. What would they do with the captain's wife and toddler? It's not like mutineers typically find themselves equipped with a good childcare plan. Then there's the alcohol fume theory, which actually has some merit. The cargo hold contained 9 barrels that had leaked, creating potentially explosive fumes in an enclosed space. Imagine the smell of nail polish remover mixed with the exhaust from a paint factory, all concentrated in a wooden box floating on the ocean. If Captain Briggs had suspected the danger of explosion or fire, he might have ordered everyone into the lifeboat as a temporary measure, planning to return once the danger passed. This theory has the advantage of explaining the orderly departure as panic, just prudent seamanship. The lifeboat might have been intended to stay nearby while the ship aired out. Unfortunately, if a storm came up or the tow line broke, the lifeboat could have been separated from the ship, leaving the Mary Celeste to sail on alone while its passengers and crew faced the Atlantic in a boat designed for emergencies, not extended voyaging. Weather could have played a role too. Sudden, violent storms are known to appear without much warning in the area where the Mary Celeste was located. Perhaps Briggs saw something approaching that made him decide to abandon ship temporarily, only to have the weather separate them permanently from their vessel. It's the maritime equivalent of stepping out of your car to check the engine and having the car somehow drive away without you. Some theories venture into more exotic territory. Sudden tidal waves can be triggered by underwater earthquakes. Giant squids could launch dramatic attacks, potentially leaving behind signs of tentacle-induced chaos. Encounters with other vessels, which somehow manage to whisk away the entire population without disturbing the cargo or leaving witnesses, have also been reported. The truly creative theories involve everything from time warps to alien abduction to spontaneous dimensional shifts. While these make for excellent late-night conversation starters, they have the disadvantage of being completely unprovable and requiring the laws of physics to take an extended coffee break. Theories are annoying because they explain some parts of the mystery but not others. The alcohol fume theory explains the orderly departure but not why the ship continued sailing in a straight line. The weather theory explains the separation but not the missing ship's papers. The piracy theory explains the missing people but not the intact cargo. Standing on the empty deck, you realize that the Mary Celeste's greatest mystery might not be what happened, but why it happened so completely. Whatever occurred, it convinced 10 people, including a cautious sea captain and a mother with a small child, to leave a perfectly seaworthy vessel for the uncertain safety of a small lifeboat. That's not a decision anyone makes lightly. Walking through the Mary Celeste now, you become something of a forensic detective, reading the story the ship tells through 1,000 small details. Ships, like houses, hold on to the echoes of the people who live in them, and this one is practically chattering with evidence if you know how to listen. The galley holds particularly intriguing clues. The stove is cold, but there are dishes that suggest breakfast was interrupted rather than never started. A coffee pot sits on the stove with ground still in it, the kind of detail that makes you picture someone getting up early, going through their morning routine, perhaps humming while they worked. A loaf of bread, now stale, is cut as though someone intended to prepare toast or sandwiches for the day ahead. In the crew's quarters, hammocks hang empty, but show the impressions of recent use. People scatter personal items as they would if they were living normally, not as if they were packing to leave permanently. A pipe lies on a small shelf, tobacco still in the bowl. Someone had been enjoying their evening smoke when something interrupted their routine. The ship's rigging tells its own story. The sails are set, but incorrectly, not in a way that would make the ship unmanageable, but in a way that suggests someone who knew what they were doing had adjusted them quickly, perhaps to make the ship stable while unmanned. It's the nautical equivalent of putting on your hazard lights before pulling over, a sign that whatever happened was planned, at least briefly. Below deck, the cargo area reveals the most intriguing evidence. 9 barrels of alcohol have leaked, their contents evaporating and creating a concentration of fumes that would make anyone nervous. The overwhelming smell resembled a paint store during a chemical spill. Any experienced captain would recognize the leak as a serious fire hazard, especially with the ship's lanterns and cooking fires. But here's what's particularly intriguing. The cargo hatches are open. In normal circumstances, you'd keep these closed to prevent water from getting in during storms. The fact that they're open suggests someone deliberately opened them, probably to ventilate the dangerous fumes. It's evidence of logical thinking under pressure, not panic. The captain's cabin provides the most personal insights. Charts are spread on the table, showing their planned route to Genoa. Navigational instruments are mostly in place, except for the chronometer, the ship's most essential tool for determining longitude. Its absence suggests whoever left took the one thing they'd absolutely need for navigation in a small boat. Sarah Briggs's belongings paint a picture of a woman who'd settled in for a long voyage but left suddenly. Her sewing basket sits open, thread still wound around her finger as if she'd looked up from her work and never looked back down. A letter to her mother-in-law lies half-finished on the small desk, stopping mid-sentence. The baby is well and growing more adventurous each day. Yesterday, she nearly... And that's where it ends. The pen lies beside the paper, ink dried on its tip. It's one of those details that makes the hair on your arm stand up, because it's so perfectly ordinary, right up until it becomes extraordinary. Little Sophia's presence is everywhere. A wooden cup rests on the floor of the main cabin. Toys are tucked into corners where little Sophia might have left them during play. A small blanket draped over the edge of a chair, as if someone had covered her for a nap and she kicked it off in her sleep. The ship's wheel is lashed in position, another sign of deliberate action rather than panic. Someone took the time to secure the helm before leaving, ensuring the ship would sail relatively straight rather than turning in circles. It's the kind of precaution you take when you're planning to come back. Perhaps most telling of all is that it's not disturbed. Valuables remain in place. The ship's modest supply of money is untouched. Personal items of obvious sentimental value, letters, photographs, small mementos, remain where their owners left them. The event wasn't a robbery, and it wasn't a hurried flight from danger. Standing in the main cabin as afternoon light streams through the portholes, you can almost feel the moment when normal life stopped. Someone was reading. The book lies open, pages slightly ruffled by the constant sea breeze coming through the cabin door. Someone was planning dinner. Vegetables sit in a basket, some beginning to wrinkle but still fresh enough to suggest recent purchase. Back in Gibraltar, where the Mary Celeste has been towed for investigation, you find yourself in the middle of what can only be described as Victorian-era bureaucratic chaos mixed with genuine maritime mystery. The British authorities, who have jurisdiction over the case, approach it with the kind of methodical thoroughness that made the empire run on time, but also occasionally missed the forest for the trees. Vice Admiralty Court Proctor Frederick Solly Flood takes charge of the investigation with the enthusiasm of someone who's been waiting his entire career for a genuinely intriguing case. Unfortunately, his enthusiasm is matched only by his suspicion that something sinister has occurred, which leads him to seek evidence of foul play in every water stain and piece of frayed rope. The first theory Flood pursues involves the crew of the Dei Gratia, the ship that found the Mary Celeste. His reasoning follows a certain Victorian logic. If you discover something suspicious, start by suspecting the people who found it. It's the maritime equivalent of assuming the person who reports a crime must be involved in it somehow. Captain Morehouse and his crew find themselves under intense scrutiny. Had they somehow arranged to meet the Mary Celeste at sea? Had they murdered its passengers and crew for the salvage money? The fact that Morehouse and Captain Briggs were acquaintances becomes, in Flood's mind, evidence of conspiracy rather than coincidence. The problem with this theory becomes apparent quickly. The salvage award for the Mary Celeste, while not insignificant, amounts to about 1/6 of the ship's value, hardly enough to justify multiple murders and an elaborate cover-up. Furthermore, the crew of the Dei Gratia would have had to be remarkably stupid criminals, since they voluntarily brought the suspicious vessel to port and submitted to investigation, rather than, say, sinking it quietly in the middle of the Atlantic. As the investigation continues, you watch expert after specialist examine the ship. Maritime surveyors crawl through every inch of the hull, seeking evidence of damage that might explain the abandonment. The experts determine that the ship is seaworthy, although it has clearly been sailing unmanned for some time. The rigging shows that wear is consistent with wind and weather, not sabotage. Dr. Patron, the island's physician, examines what appears to be blood on a sword found in the captain's cabin. This discovery sends Flood into paroxysms of excitement. Finally, evidence of violence. Unfortunately, further analysis suggests the stains are more likely rust mixed with some other substance, possibly fruit juice. The blood-stained sword becomes merely a rusty blade, and Dr. Patron's reputation for dramatic conclusions becomes a running joke among the other investigators. The cargo inspection reveals the leaked barrels and residual fumes, lending credence to the theory that alcohol vapors might have prompted the evacuation. Several investigators comment on the strong smell and the potential fire hazard it would represent to people living with open flames and oil lamps. One surveyor notes that similar cargo had caused fires on other vessels, making evacuation a reasonable precaution for any experienced captain. What emerges from weeks of testimony and investigation is a picture of the Mary Celeste as a perfectly ordinary merchant vessel that encountered some kind of situation requiring immediate but temporary evacuation. The evidence suggests careful preparation for departure, not panic or violence. The missing lifeboat, the opened cargo hatches for ventilation, the secured wheel, and the taken chronometer all point to intelligent decision-making under pressure. Flood, however, remains convinced that dark deeds have been done. His final report, while officially inconclusive, drips with suspicion about everyone involved. He seems particularly frustrated that no one has confessed to anything dramatic and that the evidence stubbornly refuses to support any of the more exciting theories about piracy, mutiny, or mass murder. The crew of the Dei Gratia finally receives their salvage award, though it's reduced from their original claim. They're clearly relieved to be done with the entire affair and to have their integrity intact, if slightly battered by weeks of suspicion and interrogation. As you read through the official reports, what strikes you most is how the investigation's focus on finding someone to blame obscured the more intriguing question of what actually happened. The bureaucratic need for criminal responsibility overshadowed the maritime mystery, turning what might have been a fascinating study in emergency seamanship into a frustrating search for villains who probably never existed. Standing on the dock in Gibraltar, watching the Mary Celeste rock gently in the harbour, you realize that sometimes the most interesting mysteries are the ones that resist easy answers. The Mary Celeste story didn't end with the Gibraltar investigation. If anything, that's where her second life as a legend really began. Like a celebrity who becomes more famous for being famous than for any particular talent, the ship found herself transformed from a working merchant vessel into maritime mythology. After the investigation, the ship was sold at auction and returned to service under new ownership. You might think this would be the end of her story, but ships that become famous for mysterious reasons tend to attract a particular kind of attention. Her new owners probably thought they were getting a bargain, a perfectly good brigantine with an interesting history. What they got instead was a vessel that seemed to carry her mystery like a persistent odor that wouldn't air out. Over the next 13 years, the Mary Celeste changed hands 17 times. This is roughly equivalent to a house being sold every 9 months, which suggests either terrible luck or a terrible reputation. Ships, like houses, can develop reputations that follow them from owner to owner, and the Mary Celeste's reputation was becoming distinctly problematic. Her various captains reported difficulties finding crews willing to sail on her. Sailors, who are professionally superstitious as a matter of survival, began to regard her as unlucky. Stories grew in the telling. What began as a mystery about missing people became tales of ghostly apparitions, mysterious voices in the rigging, and equipment that malfunctioned in inexplicable ways. The ship's final voyage came in 1885, when she was deliberately wrecked on a reef near Haiti in what appears to have been an insurance fraud attempt. Her last owner, G.C. Parker, had loaded her with worthless cargo but insured it for far more than its value. The plan was simple. Wreck Parker planned to sell the ship, claim the insurance, and profit from what had become an increasingly unprofitable vessel. Unfortunately for Parker, the insurance investigators were more competent than the Gibraltar officials had been. They quickly discovered the fraudulent cargo and Parker's scheme. He was prosecuted, though the case fell apart due to insufficient evidence. Apparently, proving insurance fraud was as tricky in the 1880s as it is today. The Mary Celeste's physical end on that Haitian reef was anticlimactic for a ship that had become synonymous with maritime mystery. She didn't disappear dramatically in the fog or sail off into the sunset. She simply ran aground in shallow water and broke apart in the waves, her timbers scattered by storms and salvaged by locals for more practical purposes. But her story was just beginning its strangest chapter. Writers discovered the Mary Celeste and found in her mystery the perfect foundation for fiction. Arthur Conan Doyle, before he became famous for Sherlock Holmes, wrote a short story called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement that took the basic facts of the Mary Celeste and embellished them with murders, racial conspiracy, and dramatic confrontations. Doyle's story was so compelling that many people began to confuse his fiction with the actual facts. Details from his imagination, like the breakfast still warm on the table or the ship's cat found alive and well, became part of the true story in popular retellings. It's a perfect example of how a positive story can become more powerful than mere facts. Hollywood eventually discovered the Mary Celeste, producing films that bore increasingly little resemblance to the historical mystery. In movie versions, the ship became haunted, cursed, or the scene of elaborate supernatural conspiracies. Each retelling added new dramatic elements while stripping away the subtle human mystery that made the original story so compelling. Standing on a modern dock, watching contemporary ships come and go, you realize that the Mary Celeste's greatest mystery isn't what happened to her passengers and crew. It's how a straightforward maritime incident became one of history's most enduring legends. The ship herself may be gone, scattered as driftwood on a Caribbean beach, but her story continues to sail on, picking up new passengers and new theories with every telling. As you stand here, having followed the Mary Celeste's transformation from a working ship to an eternal mystery, you are likely wondering what truly happened on that November morning in 1872. Like many intriguing questions in life, this one lacks a tidy, conclusive answer. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Captain Briggs faced some kind of emergency that convinced him to evacuate his ship temporarily. The evidence strongly suggests this wasn't a panicked flight. It was a calculated decision made by an experienced seaman who he believed he was taking a reasonable precaution. The open cargo hatches, the missing chronometer, and the orderly departure all point to someone who expected to return. The alcohol fume theory remains the most plausible explanation. Those 9 leaked barrels created a genuinely dangerous situation in the wooden confines of a 19th century ship. Experts in modern maritime studies generally concur that Briggs had the right to evacuate until the fumes dissipated. Perhaps the tragedy lay in the fact that he never had the opportunity to return. Perhaps a sudden squall separated the lifeboat from the ship. Perhaps the tow line broke in rough seas. Perhaps Briggs miscalculated the weather or the distance to land. Small boats in the Atlantic face enormous challenges, and the margin for error is slim. What seemed like a temporary precaution might have become a fatal miscalculation through no fault of anyone involved. Alternatively, the explanation could be something we have not yet considered. Maritime history is full of incidents where ships were abandoned for reasons that seemed perfectly logical at the time, but appear mysterious to later investigators. The ocean is a vast, unpredictable environment where the difference between routine and disaster can be measured in minutes. What makes the Mary Celeste story so enduringly fascinating isn't just the mystery itself, but what it reveals about our need to discover explanations for things that resist explanation. We've turned a probable emergency evacuation into a supernatural legend because the alternative, accepting that sometimes undesirable things happen to good people for mundane reasons, is somehow less satisfying than imagining elaborate conspiracies or paranormal interventions. The real people involved, Benjamin Briggs, Sarah, little Sophia, and the 7 crew members, have been overshadowed by their own mystery. Instead of being individuals who lived, worked, worried about their families, and faced a crisis that demanded immediate action, they have transformed into characters in a story. In our fascination with what happened to them, we sometimes forget that they were people much like ourselves, making the best decisions they could with the information they had. Perhaps that's the Mary Celeste's final lesson, that life rarely provides the clear-cut answers we crave, and that mystery isn't always sinister. Sometimes ships are abandoned for beneficial reasons that lead to tragic consequences. Sometimes people make reasonable decisions that have unreasonable outcomes. Occasionally, the most extraordinary mysteries have the most ordinary explanations. As you settle back into your comfortable spot, maybe finishing that cup of tea that's been growing cold while we wandered through this maritime puzzle, consider that the Mary Celeste's greatest gift might not be her mystery, but her reminder that the world is full of stories we'll never completely understand, and perhaps that's acceptable. Perhaps some questions are more valuable than their answers, and some mysteries are worth preserving not because they're supernatural, but because they're beautifully, frustratingly human. The Mary Celeste sails on in our imagination, her sails set for destinations we'll never know, carrying passengers we'll never meet again, bound for ports that exist only in the space between what we know and what we wonder. And sometimes, just before you fall asleep, you might find yourself wondering what little Sophia would have grown up to become, and whether Captain Briggs ever regretted that final decision to lower the lifeboat on what seemed like just another ordinary day at sea.
In the annals of military history, few disappearances have captured the imagination quite like that of Rome's Ninth Legion, the Legio Ninth Hispana. While Hollywood has painted dramatic pictures of their fate, the truth remains maddeningly elusive, wrapped in layers of archaeological uncertainty and historical debate that span nearly 2 millennia. The Ninth Legion wasn't just another military unit. Formed around 65 BCE, they earned their surname Hispana through brutal campaigns in Spain, where they learned to fight in terrain that would later define their mysterious end. These weren't parade-ground soldiers, but battle-hardened veterans who had survived Gallic wars, Germanic tribes, and the treacherous politics of late Republican Rome. By the time they arrived in Britain around 43 CE with Emperor Claudius's invasion force, they carried with them a reputation forged in blood and conquest. Their early years in Britain were marked by both triumph and disaster. In 60 CE, Queen Boudicca's rebellion caught the Roman administration completely off guard. While Governor Suetonius Paulinus was busy destroying Druid strongholds on Anglesey, the Iceni queen had united multiple tribes in a coordinated uprising that would claim an estimated 70,000 Roman lives. The Ninth Legion, stationed at Lindum Colonia, modern Lincoln, received desperate orders to march south and relieve the besieged settlements. What happened next reveals the caliber of men we're dealing with. Marching with approximately 2,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, they encountered Boudicca's forces somewhere in the fenlands of East Anglia. The engagement was catastrophic. Boudicca's warriors, fighting for their homeland and families, overwhelmed the Roman column. Most of the infantry were slaughtered, their eagle standard nearly captured. Only the cavalry and a handful of foot soldiers managed to fight their way back to their fortified base. For most legions, such a defeat would have meant disbandment and disgrace. The Ninth Legion rebuilt. New recruits arrived from the continent, veteran centurions were transferred from other units, and within a decade they were back to full strength. This resilience makes their eventual disappearance all the more perplexing. By 108 CE, the Ninth Legion was stationed at Iberacum, modern York, serving as the primary military force in northern Britain. Hadrian's Wall wouldn't be built for another decade, and the frontier remained a volatile patchwork of Roman forts, allied tribes, and hostile territories. Archaeological evidence from York shows a legion at the height of its power. Elaborate barracks, sophisticated bathhouses, and workshops producing everything from armour to decorative pottery. The men of the Ninth weren't just soldiers, they were colonisers in the truest sense. Many had British wives and children, owned property, and had invested their savings in local businesses. Inscriptions found throughout northern England show legion members dedicating altars to both Roman and Celtic gods, suggesting a degree of cultural integration that goes beyond mere military occupation. Yet for all their apparent stability, the Ninth Legion existed in a landscape of constant tension. Recent archaeological work at sites like Vindolanda has revealed the reality of frontier life through preserved wooden tablets, personal letters, duty rosters, and intelligence reports that paint a picture of an army under constant strain. Requests for reinforcements, complaints about inadequate supplies, and references to barbarian raids appear regularly in these documents. The last definitively dated inscription mentioning the Ninth Legion appears on a building stone from York, dated to approximately 108 CE. After that date, the historical record becomes frustratingly sparse. Some scholars point to later inscriptions that might reference the Legion, but these are disputed and fragmentary. What we know with certainty is that by 122 CE, when Hadrian arrived in Britain to oversee the construction of his wall, the Ninth Legion was no longer stationed at York. This absence is made more significant by what replaced them. The 6th Legion Victrix arrived from Germany around 122 CE and took over the 9th's facilities at York. Military transfers of this magnitude required extensive planning and official documentation, yet no records survive explaining what happened to the 5,000 men of the 9th Legion. They simply vanish from the historical record, leaving behind only their abandoned fortress and a mystery that has endured for 19 centuries. The absence of documentation surrounding the 9th Legion's fate is perhaps more telling than any dramatic account of their destruction. Rome was a bureaucratic empire that recorded everything from grain shipments to gladiator expenses with meticulous detail. Legion movements, casualties, and disbandments were matters of state importance, documented in multiple copies and distributed across the imperial administration. The complete silence surrounding the 9th suggests something so catastrophic or embarrassing that it was deliberately erased from official records. Consider the context of early 2nd century Britain. Emperor Trajan's aggressive expansion policies had stretched Roman resources thin across multiple frontiers. In Dacia, Germania, and the East, legions were engaged in costly campaigns that demanded constant reinforcements. Britain, despite its wealth in minerals and slaves, remained a net drain on imperial resources. The province required 4 full legions to maintain control, a massive commitment for territory that many Romans still considered the edge of the civilized world. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a frontier under increasing pressure. Excavations at Corbridge, Housesteads, and other northern forts show evidence of hasty repairs, reinforced gateways, and expanded granaries, preparations for siege warfare. More tellingly, hordes of Roman coins buried during this period and never recovered suggest that many settlements were abandoned quickly, their inhabitants fleeing south with whatever wealth they could carry. The Caledonians, the tribal confederation north of the Roman frontier, were far from the primitive warriors often portrayed in popular accounts. Recent excavations in Scotland have revealed sophisticated hill forts, with advanced defensive systems, evidence of extensive trade networks and metalworking capabilities that rivaled Roman production. These weren't random raiders, but organized resistance fighters with detailed knowledge of Roman military tactics and weaknesses. Intelligence reports preserved on wooden tablets from Vindolanda provide glimpses of this mounting pressure. References to Britunculi, wretched little Britons, attempting coordinated attacks, requests for additional scouts, and complaints about inadequate cavalry support all suggest a military situation that was gradually deteriorating. Most significantly, several tablets reference large gatherings of hostile tribes beyond the frontier, exactly the kind of coalition that could pose a serious threat to an isolated legion. The strategic situation becomes clearer when we examine Roman deployment patterns in northern Britain. The 9th Legion at York was positioned to control the river crossings and road networks of the region, but it was also dangerously exposed. Unlike the 2nd Legion at Caerleon or the 20th at Chester, the 9th had no supporting legions within easy marching distance. If they encountered serious opposition while operating beyond their base, they would be entirely on their own. Their enemies may have been precisely anticipating this isolation. Celtic warfare, particularly in the terrain of northern Britain, favoured mobility, ambush, and the kind of hit-and-run tactics that could bleed a legion dry without ever offering the pitched battle that Roman military doctrine was designed to win. The forests and moorlands beyond York provided perfect cover for this type of warfare. Recent analysis of pollen samples from the Yorkshire Dales and North Pennines shows significant reforestation during the early 2nd century, evidence that Roman agricultural settlements were being abandoned and returning to wilderness. This suggests that whatever was happening in the north was serious enough to drive civilian populations away from areas that had been peacefully occupied for decades. The timing of the 9th Legion's disappearance coincides with other troubling developments across the empire. Dio Cassius mentions serious losses in Britain during Hadrian's reign, though he doesn't specify which units were affected. The Historia Augusta, while notoriously unreliable, references military disasters in Britain that required extensive reinforcements from Germany. Most intriguingly, several sources mention that Hadrian himself was forced to take personal command of military operations in Britain, something emperors only did in cases of extreme crisis. The archaeological record from York itself provides additional clues. Layers of ash and destruction debris dated to approximately 115 to 120 CE suggest that the fortress suffered some kind of catastrophic event. While the cause could have been an accidental fire, the pattern of destruction and the immediate abandonment of certain areas suggest violence. Even more puzzling, the Legion left behind many of its personal possessions, including jewellery, religious items, and even weapons that would have been valuable to retreating soldiers. The silence that surrounds the 9th Legion's fate extends beyond official Roman records. British tribal traditions, usually rich with accounts of victories over Roman forces, contain no clear references to destroying an entire legion. This absence is particularly strange, given that such a victory would have been celebrated for generations and incorporated into the oral histories that later chroniclers like Geoffrey of Monmouth drew upon for their medieval accounts. The most persistent theory about the 9th Legion's fate, that they were wiped out in a catastrophic battle somewhere in Scotland, has captured popular imagination for good reason. It fits our understanding of Roman military disasters and provides a dramatic conclusion to their story. But the reality, as revealed through decades of archaeological investigation, is far more complex and troubling than any simple narrative of military defeat. The annihilation theory gained credibility from parallels with other well-documented Roman disasters. The destruction of Varus's 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE demonstrated that even experienced Roman forces could be completely overwhelmed when lured into unfavourable terrain by determined enemies. The loss of nearly 20,000 men in a single campaign shocked the empire and led to fundamental changes in frontier policy. Could something similar have happened to the 9th Legion in the forests and highlands of Scotland? Archaeological evidence from Scotland provides tantalising hints that major military operations were indeed taking place during the period of the 9th Legion's disappearance. Excavations at sites such as Inchtuthil have uncovered massive Roman fortifications, hastily abandoned around 110 CE. These weren't temporary marching camps, but substantial bases designed for long-term occupation, suggesting that Rome was planning permanent expansion into Scotland. The construction and subsequent abandonment of these Scottish forts tells a story of ambitious plans gone wrong. Inchtuthil, located on the River Tay about 60 miles north of the current Scottish border, was designed to house an entire legion. Its builders even installed sophisticated underground heating systems and began construction of a hospital complex. However, within a few years, they systematically demolished the site, burying or destroying its valuable materials instead of leaving them for enemy use. This pattern of construction, followed by rapid abandonment, appears at multiple sites throughout Scotland. At Stracathro, Cardion, and Camelon, archaeologists have found evidence of Roman bases that were occupied for only a few years before being deliberately destroyed. The speed and thoroughness of these demolitions suggest that the withdrawal wasn't planned, but forced by military necessity. But here's where the annihilation theory begins to break down. Roman military disasters, however catastrophic, always left archaeological traces. The Teutoburg forest has yielded thousands of artifacts from the destroyed legions, weapons, armour, coins, and personal effects scattered across the battlefield. Similar evidence exists for other documented defeats, from Carhaix to Adrianople. If the battle destroyed the Ninth Legion, where are the material remains? Intensive archaeological surveys of the Scottish Highlands, using everything from metal detectors to ground-penetrating radar, have failed to locate any concentration of Roman military equipment that might indicate a major battlefield. This absence is particularly puzzling given the excellent preservation conditions in Scottish peat bogs, which have preserved organic materials for thousands of years. The logistical challenges of destroying an entire legion also deserve consideration. The Ninth Legion at full strength comprised approximately 5,000 men, plus auxiliary troops and camp followers. This wasn't a small raiding party that could disappear without a trace, but a small army with massive supply requirements. Any campaign capable of destroying such a force would necessarily involve thousands of enemy warriors and would have generated legends and stories that should have survived in Celtic oral tradition. Recent analysis of Caledonian weapon technology suggests that while these tribes were formidable opponents, they lacked the organizational capability to coordinate the kind of massive assault required to overwhelm a full legion. Their strength lay in mobility and guerrilla tactics, not the concentrated firepower needed for a decisive battle. Archaeological evidence shows they were master ambushers and raiders, but there's no indication they could have fielded the 15,000 to 20,000 warriors necessary to guarantee victory against a prepared Roman force. The terrain itself presents additional problems for the annihilation theory. Scotland's mountains and forests would have made it nearly impossible for enemies to prevent survivors from escaping. Roman military doctrine emphasized tactical withdrawal when facing overwhelming odds, and even in disasters like Teutoburg Forest, significant numbers of soldiers managed to fight their way back to Roman territory. For the entire Ninth Legion to be eliminated, they would have had to be trapped in terrain that allowed no escape, a scenario that seems increasingly unlikely given what we know about their deployment and tactics. Perhaps most puzzling of all is the timing. Why did the Romans not respond immediately after the Ninth Legion's destruction in a major battle? Historical precedent suggests that legion losses triggered massive retaliation campaigns. The destruction of Varus's legions led to years of punitive expeditions under Germanicus. The loss of even part of a legion typically resulted in immediate reinforcement and revenge operations. Yet there's no evidence of increased Roman military activity in Scotland following the Ninth Legion's disappearance. Instead, the archaeological record shows Roman withdrawal from advanced positions and the adoption of a more defensive posture. This pattern suggests not a sudden military disaster, but a gradual recognition that the costs of expansion outweighed the benefits. The Ninth Legion's fate may have been less dramatic but more emblematic of Rome's imperial overstretch than any single catastrophic battle. A more nuanced examination of the evidence suggests a fate for the Ninth Legion that, while less dramatic than annihilation, may be more historically accurate and ultimately more unsettling. Rather than disappearing in a single catastrophic event, the Legion may have been systematically ground down through years of attrition warfare, a slow bleeding of men and morale that eventually rendered them ineffective as a fighting force. This theory finds support in the broader context of Roman frontier warfare during the early 2nd century. Unlike the set-piece battles celebrated in imperial propaganda, the reality of frontier service involved constant, low-level conflict that rarely made it into official histories. Patrols that never returned, supply convoys ambushed in mountain passes, isolated outposts overrun in the night. These small defeats accumulated over time, creating a cumulative effect that could be more devastating than any single battle. The wooden tablets from Vindolanda provide a window into this reality. Between requests for warm clothing and complaints about beer quality, we find references to missing patrols, requests for replacement officers, and ominous mentions of areas that had become too dangerous for routine operations. One particularly telling document requests information about soldiers who had been detached from their units and never returned, a bureaucratic euphemism that likely masked casualties too numerous or embarrassing to report in detail. Archaeological evidence from northern England supports this picture of gradual deterioration. Roman sites dating to the early 2nd century show increasing evidence of fortification, not the confident expansion typical of successful conquest, but the defensive preparations of an army under pressure. Watchtowers were built closer together, supply routes were rerouted to avoid vulnerable terrain, and civilian settlements were relocated behind military lines. The demographic evidence is particularly revealing. Studies of tombstone inscriptions from northern England show a marked increase in military deaths during the period 100 to 120 CE. Disease or accidents may account for individual deaths, but the statistical pattern indicates systematic losses surpassing normal replacement rates. More significantly, these inscriptions show an increasing reliance on foreign recruits, men from Germany, Gaul, and even North Africa, suggesting that local recruitment could no longer maintain legion strength. This manpower crisis wasn't unique to Britain. Across the empire, Rome was struggling to maintain military strength as the costs of expansion outgrew the benefits. Trajan's Dacian campaigns had consumed enormous resources, and his eastern adventures had ended in strategic failure. The imperial system that had sustained centuries of expansion was showing signs of strain, and frontier provinces like Britain were particularly vulnerable to resource shortages. The 9th Legion's position at York made them especially susceptible to this kind of gradual attrition. As the northernmost major Roman base, they bore primary responsibility for monitoring and responding to tribal movements across a vast area. Their task meant constant patrolling, frequent small-scale operations, and the kind of distributed deployment that maximized exposure to enemy action while minimizing mutual support between units. Recent computer modelling of Roman patrol patterns in northern England, based on archaeological evidence of road networks and fort positions, suggests that the 9th Legion was operating at unsustainable levels. To cover their assigned territory effectively, they would have needed to maintain dozens of simultaneous operations, with small detachments scattered across hundreds of square miles. This deployment pattern, while necessary for controlling the region, left individual units vulnerable to concentrated enemy attacks. The enemy they faced had adapted specifically to exploit this vulnerability. Celtic warriors had centuries of experience fighting Romans and had learned to avoid the pitched battles where Roman discipline and equipment provided decisive advantages. Instead, they perfected ambush tactics, hit-and-run raids, and the kind of psychological warfare that could break down unit cohesion over time. Intelligence reports from the period describe increasingly sophisticated enemy operations. Rather than random raids, Roman commanders were facing coordinated campaigns that targeted specific vulnerabilities: supply lines, isolated outposts, and communication networks. The Caledonians had learned to fight a war of attrition, using their knowledge of local terrain and Roman deployment patterns to inflict maximum casualties while avoiding decisive engagement. Perhaps most significantly, they had learned to target Roman morale. Instead of simply killing captured soldiers, they subjected them to ritual torture and public execution, aiming to terrorize other Roman forces. Bodies were left in locations where they would be found by Roman patrols, often mutilated in ways that conveyed specific messages about the fate awaiting invaders. This psychological warfare proved especially effective against troops who were already fatigued and operating in remote areas. The cumulative effect of these pressures would have been devastating to unit effectiveness. As experienced soldiers were lost and replaced by raw recruits, institutional knowledge disappeared. As morale declined, desertion rates increased. As recruitment became more difficult, unit strength fell below effective levels. Eventually, what remained of the 9th Legion would have been a hollow shell, still officially existing, but no longer capable of meaningful military operations. The most prosaic explanation for the 9th Legion's disappearance may also be the most historically accurate. They were transferred elsewhere in the Empire, and subsequently destroyed in campaigns so distant from Britain that their fate never became part of British historical tradition. This theory, while lacking the dramatic appeal of annihilation narratives, finds support in Roman administrative practices and the broader strategic situation of the early 2nd century. Rome routinely transferred military units across vast distances to meet emerging threats or capitalize on new opportunities. The empire's military system depended on this flexibility, with legions moving from Britain to Germany and from Spain to Syria as imperial priorities shifted. These transfers weren't always well documented, particularly when they involved urgent responses to crisis situations. Evidence for this theory comes from an unexpected source: inscriptions found in the Netherlands dating to approximately 120 CE. these fragmentary texts reference soldiers from the Ninth Legion in contexts that suggest active service rather than veterans settled in retirement colonies. While the inscriptions are incomplete and their interpretation disputed, they raise the possibility that at least part of the Legion survived to serve elsewhere in the Empire. More compelling evidence comes from the eastern provinces, where recent archaeological work has uncovered tombstone inscriptions that may reference former members of the Ninth Legion. These monuments, found in locations ranging from Jordan to Armenia, commemorate soldiers whose career histories include service in Britain during the relevant time. While none explicitly mention the Ninth Legion by name, the career patterns are consistent with men who might have been transferred from Britain to serve in Trajan's eastern campaigns. The strategic situation would have justified such a transfer. Trajan's Parthian War, 114 to 117 CE, was consuming enormous resources and experiencing significant setbacks. Roman forces in Mesopotamia were facing determined resistance from both Parthian armies and local populations. The campaign that was supposed to secure Rome's eastern frontier had instead created a military crisis that demanded immediate reinforcement. Transferring an entire legion from Britain to the east would have made strategic sense. The Ninth Legion had extensive experience with guerrilla warfare and unconventional enemies, exactly the kind of expertise needed in Mesopotamia. Their departure from Britain could have been presented as temporary, a strategic redeployment to meet immediate needs, with promises of eventual return that were never fulfilled. The administrative machinery existed to accomplish such a transfer with minimal documentation. Emergency powers granted to field commanders during active campaigns allowed them to requisition resources, including military units, without the usual bureaucratic procedures. If the Ninth Legion was transferred under such circumstances, the paperwork might have been minimal, and subsequently lost during the chaos that followed Trajan's death and Hadrian's abandonment of the eastern conquests. Archaeological evidence from the Roman East provides tantalizing hints of large-scale troop movements during this period. Excavations at military sites in Syria and Jordan have revealed massive construction projects dating to 115 to 120 CE, suggesting the arrival of significant reinforcements. More significantly, these sites show evidence of Northern European construction techniques and organizational patterns that are characteristic of British-based legions. The fate of transferred legions in the East is well documented and universally grim. Roman forces in Mesopotamia faced not only military opposition, but also environmental challenges that proved devastating to European troops. Heat, disease, and unfamiliar terrain combined to create casualty rates that far exceeded anything experienced on the northern frontiers. Entire units that had served successfully for decades were wiped out within months of arrival in the desert. Recent analysis of Roman military records from the eastern provinces reveals the systematic destruction of multiple military units during Trajan's campaigns. The 22nd Legion Deotariana disappears from records during this period, as do several auxiliary cohorts and cavalry units. These losses were so extensive that Hadrian was forced to reorganize the eastern armies completely and abandon most of Trajan's territorial gains. If the Ninth Legion was indeed transferred to the east, their destruction would have been neither unique nor particularly noteworthy in the context of the broader military disaster that Trajan's eastern adventure had become. Their loss would have been recorded as part of the general catastrophe, rather than attributed to their specific unit identity, explaining why no clear record of their fate survives in sources focused on British history. This theory also explains the curious absence of the Ninth Legion from Hadrian's British campaigns. When the emperor arrived in Britain in 122 CE to address the deteriorating security situation, he brought with him the 6th Legion from Germany to replace the missing 9th. If the 9th had been destroyed in Britain, their replacement would likely have been framed as reinforcement rather than substitution. The clean administrative transfer suggests a planned replacement of a unit that was expected to be unavailable for British service. The replacement pattern itself provides additional evidence. The 6th Legion Victrix was an experienced unit with a distinguished record, but they were also specialists in frontier warfare rather than siege operations or pitched battles. This suggests that Roman planners expected them to face the same kind of irregular warfare that had characterised British operations during the 9th Legion's tenure, exactly what we would expect if the 9th had been transferred rather than destroyed. The search for the 9th Legion's fate has driven some of the most innovative archaeological research of the past century, revealing not just clues about their disappearance, but also transforming our understanding of Roman Britain itself. Modern techniques from ground-penetrating radar to DNA analysis of ancient remains have painted an increasingly complex picture of frontier life that challenges traditional narratives about Roman military efficiency and imperial control. Excavations at York, the 9th Legion's last known base, have revealed a fortress in transition during the crucial period of 110 to 120 CE. Rather than the orderly abandonment suggested by traditional histories, the archaeological evidence points to a more chaotic departure. Personal belongings were left behind in significant quantities, including items that soldiers would normally have taken with them during a planned transfer, religious amulets, family heirlooms, and even savings buried in pottery jars that were never retrieved. Perhaps most significantly, recent excavations have uncovered evidence of hasty modifications to the fortress's defences during this period. New walls were built using recycled stone from demolished buildings, gates were narrowed and reinforced, and additional watchtowers were constructed within the fortress itself. These aren't the actions of a confident garrison preparing for routine transfer, but of soldiers expecting attack. The pattern of abandonment extends beyond York to numerous smaller installations throughout northern England. At sites like Moulton, Bro-on-Humber and Piercebridge, archaeological layers from the early 2nd century show similar evidence of rapid departure: cooking fires left to burn out, storage areas hastily emptied, and defensive positions that were deliberately dismantled to prevent enemy use. The geographical distribution of these abandonments suggests a coordinated withdrawal from advanced positions rather than the random pattern we might expect from gradual attrition. DNA analysis of human remains from this period has provided another piece of the puzzle. Skeletal remains from Roman cemeteries in northern England show a significant increase in violent deaths during 110 to 120 CE, with weapon wounds becoming far more common than in earlier periods. More intriguingly, isotope analysis of teeth and bones reveals that many of these individuals were recent arrivals in Britain, consistent with emergency reinforcements rushed north to replace mounting casualties. The evidence from Scotland is equally revealing. Intensive archaeological surveys using LiDAR technology have identified numerous previously unknown Roman installations throughout the southern Scottish Highlands. These weren't the major fortresses that appear in historical accounts, but smaller signal stations, supply depots, and temporary camps that suggest extensive operations in supposedly unconquered territory. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from these sites reveals a pattern of occupation that closely matches the period of the 9th Legion's disappearance. Many show evidence of violent destruction around 115 to 120 CE, with burned timbers and scattered military equipment suggesting coordinated enemy attacks. The distribution of these sites implies that Roman forces were operating far deeper into Scotland than traditional histories suggest, and that their withdrawal was neither voluntary nor orderly. Environmental archaeology has added another dimension to our understanding. Pollen analysis from sites throughout northern England and southern Scotland shows significant ecological changes during the early 2nd century. Areas that had been under cultivation for decades reverted to woodland, while highland regions show evidence of increased human activity consistent with refugee populations fleeing lowland areas. These environmental changes paint a picture of widespread social disruption that extended far beyond military operations. The Roman conquest of Britain had created complex networks of alliance and trade that linked tribes from the Scottish Highlands to the English Channel. The collapse of these networks, suggested by the archaeological evidence, would have affected thousands of people and fundamentally altered the political landscape of northern Britain. Recent discoveries at Hadrian's Wall itself provide additional context for the 9th Legion's disappearance. Excavations at key fortresses like Housesteads and Birdoswald have revealed construction techniques and architectural features that suggest they were built not just as frontier defences but as refuges for populations retreating from areas further north. Underground storage areas, expanded medical facilities, and residential quarters designed for non-military personnel all point to a defensive strategy based on consolidation rather than expansion. Perhaps most intriguingly, several sites along Hadrian's Wall have yielded inscriptions and graffiti that appear to reference the Ninth Legion. Individual soldiers, carving these informal commemorations into stone instead of official monuments, reveal the way their contemporaries remembered the Legion's disappearance. The Ninth's fate was known to the garrison troops who replaced them as the Lost Brothers, and those who went north imply. The cumulative weight of this archaeological evidence suggests a picture far more complex than any single theory of the Ninth Legion's fate. Rather than disappearing in a single dramatic event, they appear to have been caught up in a broader collapse of Roman control in northern Britain, a collapse that was subsequently covered up through a combination of official silence and strategic redeployment of resources. Nearly 2,000 years after their disappearance, the fate of the Ninth Legion continues to generate new theories, archaeological discoveries, and scholarly debates that reveal as much about our time as about ancient Rome. The persistence of this mystery reflects something fundamental about how we understand power, empire, and the limits of military might, questions that remain remarkably relevant in our contemporary world. Recent advances in archaeological technology have created opportunities for investigation that previous generations of scholars could never have imagined. Satellite imagery capable of detecting subtle ground disturbances has identified potential Roman sites across Scotland that remain to be excavated. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed buried structures at known Roman installations that may contain crucial evidence about their abandonment. Most promising of all, advances in DNA analysis now allow researchers to trace population movements and military recruitment patterns with unprecedented precision. A 2023 excavation at a previously unknown site near Stirling uncovered what may be the most significant evidence yet discovered. Preliminary analysis of artifacts suggests a Roman military presence in the area during precisely the period when the Ninth Legion disappeared from historical records. More importantly, the site shows evidence of violent destruction followed by deliberate concealment, exactly what we might expect if Roman authorities were attempting to erase evidence of a military disaster. But perhaps the most significant recent development has been the recognition that the Ninth Legion's disappearance was part of a broader pattern of Roman retreat from advanced positions across multiple frontiers. Similar mysteries surround the fate of other military units in Germany, Dacia, and the eastern provinces during the same period. Such evidence suggests that the early 2nd century marked a turning point in Roman imperial strategy, a shift from expansion to consolidation that required difficult choices about which territories to defend and which to abandon. The administrative records from this period, fragmentary as they are, reveal an empire under unprecedented strain. Population decline in Italy, recruitment difficulties across the provinces, and the enormous costs of maintaining frontier defences had created a crisis that demanded radical solutions. The disappearance of entire military units may have been not an accident of war but a deliberate policy of strategic withdrawal disguised as temporary redeployment. This interpretation gains support from the broader historical context. Hadrian's reign marked the end of Roman territorial expansion and the beginning of a long period of defensive consolidation. His wall across northern Britain wasn't just a military fortification, but a symbolic statement that the empire had reached its sustainable limits. The fate of the Ninth Legion may have been an early casualty of this strategic reorientation. Modern conflict studies provide additional perspectives on the mystery. Military historians now recognize that empire collapse often begins not with dramatic defeats, but with the gradual erosion of military effectiveness through overextension and resource exhaustion. The Roman Empire of the early 2nd century displays many of the warning signs that modern analysts associate with imperial overstretch, increasing reliance on foreign recruits, difficulties maintaining supply lines, and the progressive abandonment of remote positions. The psychological dimensions of the mystery deserve equal attention. The Ninth Legion's disappearance has become a powerful metaphor for the limits of imperial power and the vulnerability of seemingly invincible institutions. In an age when major powers again find themselves struggling with the costs of global military commitments, The fate of Rome's lost legion resonates with contemporary anxieties about overextension and strategic failure. Popular culture's fascination with the mystery reflects these deeper concerns. From Rosemary Sutcliffe's classic novel, The Eagle of the Ninth, to Hollywood's The Eagle, fictional accounts of the legion's fate consistently emphasize themes of imperial hubris, cultural conflict, and the price of military aggression. These narratives say as much about our time's relationship with military power as they do about ancient Rome. The academic study of the mystery has also evolved to reflect changing perspectives on ancient history. Earlier generations of scholars approached the question primarily through political and military analysis, focusing on battles, campaigns, and official records. Contemporary historians are more likely to examine social, economic, and environmental factors that might explain the legion's disappearance. This shift in methodology has revealed new dimensions of the mystery, while generating fresh debates about methodology and interpretation. Perhaps most significantly, the search for the Ninth Legion has contributed to our understanding of how historical memory functions. The systematic erasure of their fate from official records demonstrates the power of imperial authorities to control historical narratives, while the persistence of the mystery shows the limits of that control. In an age of information warfare and contested narratives, the Roman approach to managing inconvenient truths offers sobering lessons about the relationship between power and truth. The ultimate fate of the Ninth Legion may never be definitively established. Too much time has passed, too many records have been lost, and too many archaeological sites remain unexplored. But perhaps the value of the mystery lies not in its solution, but in the questions it continues to raise about empire, power, and the human cost of imperial ambition. What we can say with certainty is that approximately 5,000 men, soldiers, officers, support personnel, and their families disappeared from the historical record during one of the most critical periods in British history. Their individual stories, hopes, fears, and final moments remain unknowable, lost in the mists of time that have swallowed so many other human dramas. Yet their collective fate continues to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that even the mightiest empires are built on the lives and sacrifices of ordinary people whose names history rarely remembers. The Ninth Legion's disappearance stands as one of history's great unsolved mysteries, a puzzle that continues to challenge our understanding of the past, while illuminating uncomfortable truths about power, empire, and the price of imperial ambition. In their silence, they speak volumes about the human dimension of historical forces that shaped our world.
In the summer of 1917, Catherine Wiley stepped through the factory doors of the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, clutching her employment letter with trembling fingers. At 19, she had never imagined that her penmanship skills would land her such a coveted position. The war effort demanded precision workers, and dial painting paid better than most jobs for young women. The factory floor buzzed with activity. Rows of women sat hunched over workbenches, their faces illuminated by the ethereal green glow emanating from small glass vials. Catherine had never seen anything quite so beautiful. The radium paint seemed to capture moonlight itself, holding it prisoner in each tiny brushstroke applied to watch faces destined for soldiers overseas. Mrs. Margaret Carlo, the floor supervisor, appeared beside Catherine's shoulder. Her breath carried the metallic scent that Catherine would later recognize as radium's signature calling card. "Welcome to the most important work a young lady can do for her country," Mrs. Carlo announced, gesturing toward an empty station. "Each timepiece you paint might save a soldier's life in the trenches. They need to read their watches in complete darkness." The instructions seemed simple enough. Dip the camel hairbrush in radium paint, point the tip between your lips to achieve the finest possible line, then carefully trace the numerals on each watch dial. The technique, known as lip pointing, had been perfected by experienced workers who could complete a watch face in mere minutes. Catherine watched Grace Fryer, a seasoned dial painter, demonstrate the method with practiced ease. "The taste takes some getting used to," Grace admitted, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. A faint luminescent residue remained on her skin. but you'll hardly notice it after a few days. Some of the girls even say it's rather pleasant, slightly sweet with a mineral finish. Catherine's first attempt proved clumsy. The brush felt unwieldy between her lips, and the paint seemed to resist her guidance. Mrs. Carlo observed patiently before offering encouragement. Don't worry, dear. Yesterday's new girl is already painting 12 watches an hour. The company pays 5 cents per completed dial, so your earnings depend entirely on your speed and accuracy. The mathematics appealed to Catherine's practical nature. If she could match the productivity of experienced workers, she might earn more in a week than her father made in a month at the textile mill. The war had created unprecedented opportunities for women willing to master specialized skills. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine found her rhythm. The radium paint began to feel familiar on her tongue, and her brushstrokes grew more confident. Around her, conversations flowed freely among the workers. They discussed everything from the latest motion pictures to their brothers and sweethearts fighting in France. "Have you noticed how our clothes glow after work?" asked Molly Maggia, a petite brunette who had been with the company for nearly 2 years. She held up her apron, which indeed seemed to emit a faint luminescence in the factory's shadowed corners. "Sometimes I can read by my own light when I get home. My little sister thinks I'm magical." The women laughed at this revelation, comparing their glowing fingernails and hair. Some had begun wearing their best dresses to work, delighting in how the radium dust transformed ordinary fabric into something otherworldly. They called themselves the Ghost Girls and took pride in their unique appearance. Catherine soon discovered that the luminous effects extended beyond mere clothing. Her teeth had acquired a subtle gleam that made her smile particularly striking in dim light. Her mother initially expressed concern, but Catherine assured her that the company's medical examinations had found all the workers in perfect health. Dr. Cecil Drinker, who occasionally visited the factory to observe operations, had even complimented the women on their robust appearance. He mentioned that radium was being used in various health tonics and cosmetics, suggesting that their daily exposure might actually provide beneficial effects. Several society women in New York had begun paying substantial sums for radium treatments at exclusive spas. The work environment fostered a sense of camaraderie that Catherine had never experienced. The women shared lunches, celebrated birthdays, and discussed their dreams for the future. Many hoped to save enough money to attend secretarial school or help their families purchase homes. The war had created a temporary window of economic opportunity that none wanted to waste. As autumn approached, Catherine had mastered the lip-pointing technique and consistently painted 20 watches per hour. Her weekly earnings exceeded those of most men in her neighborhood, and she took pride in contributing significantly to her family's income. The mysterious green glow had become as familiar as daylight, and she couldn't imagine working anywhere else. Yet subtle changes had begun to manifest among some of the longer-term employees. Grace Fryer occasionally complained of jaw pain, and Molly Maggia had developed an unusual fatigue that seemed unrelated to the demanding work schedule. Catherine noticed these developments, but attributed them to the natural stresses of wartime employment. The radium paint continued to fascinate her. Each brushstroke seemed to capture starlight, and she marveled at the scientific breakthrough that made such illumination possible. Marie Curie's discovery had revolutionized industry and medicine, and Catherine felt honored to participate in its practical application. By the spring of 1918, the United States Radium Corporation had expanded its operations considerably. The factory now employed over 200 women, working in shifts around the clock to meet military contracts. Catherine Wiley had become one of the most productive dial painters, earning recognition from management and the respect of her colleagues. However, disturbing patterns had begun to emerge among the workforce. Molly Maggia, once the most vivacious worker on the floor, had developed a persistent cough that echoed through the factory halls. Her complexion, previously radiant with health, had taken on a greyish pallor that concerned her fellow workers. "It's just the spring weather," Molly insisted when Catherine expressed worry. "My mother always said the changing seasons affect some people more than others." Yet her voice had grown hoarse, and she frequently paused during conversations to catch her breath. Grace Fryer had also begun experiencing unusual symptoms. Her jaw ached constantly, particularly when she awakened in the morning. The company nurse, Miss Davies, suggested that Grace might be grinding her teeth due to the concentration required for detailed work. She recommended a nightly mouth guard and advised Grace to chew gum during her breaks to exercise the jaw muscles. Catherine found herself studying her colleagues more carefully. She noticed that several women who had worked at the factory for over 18 months displayed similar characteristics. Their energy levels had declined noticeably, and they seemed to tire more easily during the demanding workdays. Some complained of mysterious bone pain that seemed to migrate throughout their bodies. The company's response to these health concerns remained consistently reassuring. Dr. Stanford, the industrial physician who conducted monthly examinations, emphasized that radium was being prescribed by leading medical professionals for various ailments. He cited recent articles in medical journals that praised radium's therapeutic properties for treating arthritis, tuberculosis, and other conditions. You ladies are receiving the equivalent of expensive medical treatments simply by performing your patriotic duties, Dr. Stanford explained during one of his visits. Some wealthy patients pay hundreds of dollars for radium therapy that you receive naturally through your work environment. Catherine wanted to believe these explanations, but her observational skills had sharpened during her months at the factory. She began keeping private notes about the changes she witnessed among her colleagues. The documentation started innocently enough, merely recording who seemed tired or complained of specific symptoms. The most troubling development involved Molly Maggia's teeth. What had begun as minor jaw discomfort had progressed to serious dental problems. 2 of her molars had become loose, and her dentist expressed bewilderment about the condition. He had never encountered a tooth deterioration of such severity in such a young, otherwise healthy patient. Molly tried to maintain her characteristic optimism, but the pain had begun affecting her work performance. She could no longer point her brush between her lips without experiencing sharp discomfort. Mrs. Carla reluctantly assigned her to mixing paint, a position that paid less but required minimal lip contact with the brush. Catherine also noticed changes in her body, though she initially dismissed them as insignificant. Her fingernails had become brittle, breaking easily despite her careful attention to hand care. More concerning was a persistent metallic taste that had developed over the past month. Even her favorite foods seemed to carry an underlying mineral flavor. The social dynamics among the workers had begun to shift as well. Those experiencing health problems formed informal support groups, sharing remedies and comparing symptoms. Newer employees, such as Catherine, struggled to balance their loyalty to longtime colleagues with their fear of jeopardizing their own positions by acknowledging the problems. Miss Sarah Mylifer developed an unusual rash on her hands and forearms just 2 months after she started working at the factory with Catherine. The company nurse suggested she might be allergic to the soap used in the washrooms, but the condition persisted despite switching to different cleansing products. Catherine began to research radium independently, spending her evenings at the public library reading scientific journals and medical texts. The information she discovered proved contradictory. While some sources praised radium's therapeutic applications, others mentioned potential hazards associated with excessive exposure. One article particularly caught her attention. A researcher in Europe had reported cases of radium poisoning among scientists working with radioactive materials. The symptoms described in the study matched many of the problems she had observed among her colleagues: anemia, bone pain, dental deterioration, and progressive weakness. When Catherine mentioned this research to Grace Fryer, her friend's reaction surprised her. Grace admitted that she had also been conducting private investigations into radium's effects. Together, they began to document their observations more systematically, creating a detailed record of health changes among the factory workers. Their informal study revealed disturbing patterns. Women who had worked at the factory longest showed the most severe symptoms. Those who painted the most watches per day, requiring frequent lip pointing, seemed particularly affected. The correlation between exposure duration and health problems appeared undeniable. Catherine faced a troubling dilemma. She needed her job to support her family, and the work had provided financial security beyond her previous dreams. Yet the evidence suggested that continued exposure to radium might be harming her health and that of her colleagues. The company's medical authorities continued to insist that radium posed no dangers, but their reassurances rang increasingly hollow. The mystery deepened when Catherine learned that several former employees had left the factory due to illness. When she attempted to contact these women, she discovered that some had died from conditions that their doctors could not adequately explain. The company had not informed current employees about these deaths, and Catherine began to suspect that management might be deliberately concealing important information. The devastating news of summer 1918 rocked the foundation of Catherine Wiley's meticulously crafted world. Molly Maggia, the spirited young woman who had welcomed Catherine to the factory floor just 1 year earlier, had died at the age of 24. The official cause of death listed syphilis, a diagnosis that outraged those who knew Molly's character and moral standards. Catherine stood in the cemetery beside Grace Fryer and a dozen other dial painters, watching as Molly's coffin was lowered into the ground. The funeral director had mentioned something peculiar to Molly's sister. The body seemed to emit a faint glow, even in death. This detail was whispered among the mourners, but never officially acknowledged. Dr. Barry, who had attended Molly during her final weeks, privately expressed doubts about the syphilis diagnosis. He confided to Molly's family that he had never encountered such extensive bone deterioration and jaw necrosis in any syphilis patient. Her jawbone had literally crumbled in his hands during examination, yet other symptoms typical of the disease were entirely absent. The factory management's response to Molly's death proved coldly bureaucratic. Mrs. Carlo announced that while the company regretted the loss, medical experts had confirmed that her illness bore no relation to her employment. Workers were reminded that radium exposure remained perfectly safe and that their medical examinations continued to show normal results. Catherine had begun to question the reliability of these medical examinations. The company physicians seemed to focus exclusively on weight measurements and general appearance while ignoring specific complaints about jaw pain, fatigue, and dental problems. Often, the company physicians dismissed workers who mentioned concerning symptoms by suggesting better nutrition or increased exercise. Grace Fryer had grown increasingly militant about the situation. She began organizing informal meetings among the workers to discuss their health concerns and share information. These gatherings took place away from the factory, usually in someone's home or at a local church social hall. Catherine initially hesitated to attend, fearing repercussions from management, but her loyalty to her colleagues eventually overcame her caution. During one such meeting, the women compiled a disturbing inventory of health problems. Edna Hussman reported that her teeth were loosening and that her jaw ached constantly. Quinta MacDonald described mysterious anemia that left her exhausted despite adequate rest and nutrition. Albina Larice had developed a limp due to unexplained hip pain that worsened each month. The pattern became undeniable when they compared notes systematically. Every woman who had worked at the factory for more than 6 months reported some combination of dental problems, bone pain, anemia, or mysterious rashes. The longest employed women displayed the most severe symptoms. The correlation between duration of employment and illness severity could not be explained as coincidence. Catherine's own health had begun to deteriorate more noticeably. Her menstrual periods had become irregular, and she experienced frequent headaches that seemed unrelated to stress or fatigue. Most disturbing was the persistent metallic taste that had intensified to the point where food had lost much of its appeal. She had lost 12 pounds over the past 3 months, despite maintaining her usual diet. The women decided to seek independent medical opinions from physicians not affiliated with the United States Radium Corporation. Dr. Theodore Blum, a dentist in Newark, agreed to examine several of the workers without charge. His findings proved alarming and would later contribute to medical literature under the term radium jaw. Dr. Blum discovered extensive bone necrosis in every patient he examined. The jawbones showed signs of progressive deterioration that he had never encountered in his decades of practice. He documented his findings meticulously, noting that the bone damage appeared to radiate outward from the areas of greatest radium concentration. When Dr. Blum attempted to contact the company's medical staff to discuss his findings, he encountered surprising resistance. The company physicians questioned his qualifications and suggested that the patient's psychological expectations might bias his examinations. They maintained that extensive research had proven radium's safety and that isolated cases of illness could not be attributed to workplace exposure. Catherine began to research the backgrounds of the company's medical advisors. She discovered that several had financial interests in radium-related businesses and that their opinions might not be entirely objective. This revelation reinforced her increasing belief that the company was purposefully misleading the workers about the risks associated with their employment. Some workers reported pressure from company representatives to refrain from seeking outside medical attention, further complicating the situation. Supervisors suggested that discussing health problems with unauthorized physicians might be considered disloyal to the war effort. The company reminded some workers that sharing information about factory operations might violate confidentiality clauses in defense contracts. Grace Fryer had grown increasingly frustrated with the company's evasive responses to their concerns. She began contacting former employees who had left due to illness, attempting to document the full scope of the health crisis. Many of these women reported that their conditions had continued to deteriorate even after leaving the factory, suggesting that radium exposure might cause permanent damage. The mystery deepened when Catherine learned about similar problems at radium dial factories in other locations. Workers in Ottawa, Illinois, and Waterbury, Connecticut had reported health issues identical to those experienced in Orange, New Jersey. The consistency of symptoms across different facilities suggested a systemic problem rather than isolated incidents. Catherine faced an increasingly difficult choice. Her family depended on her income, and factory jobs remained scarce for young women without extensive education. Yet continuing to work at the United States Radium Corporation might be slowly killing her. The glowing paint that had once seemed so beautiful now appeared sinister, each brushstroke potentially adding to her accumulated exposure to a substance that might be destroying her body from within. The war had ended, but the battle for the truth about radium exposure was just beginning. Catherine realized that she and her colleagues might need to challenge not only their employer, but also the medical establishment and possibly the government itself to protect their health and ensure that other young women would not face similar dangers. By the autumn of 1919, Catherine Wiley had transformed from an eager young worker into an amateur detective, methodically documenting evidence of what appeared to be a systematic cover-up. The United States Radium Corporation initiated new policies that appeared to shield workers from uncovering the truth about their declining health. The company had installed new ventilation systems and required workers to use different brushes, claiming these changes would improve efficiency. However, Catherine noticed that management personnel had begun wearing protective equipment when visiting the factory floor, while workers continued their daily exposure without any protective measures. This discrepancy raised disturbing questions about what company officials actually knew about radium's dangers. Dr. Cecil Drinker returned to the factory that autumn to conduct what he described as a routine industrial hygiene study. Catherine observed his visit carefully, noting that he spent considerable time measuring air quality and collecting samples from work surfaces. His demeanor seemed more serious than during previous visits, and he asked pointed questions about worker health that suggested genuine concern rather than routine inquiry. When Dr. Drinker's report was completed several months later, the company refused to share its contents with employees. Through a contact at the local health department, Catherine learned that the study had identified significant safety hazards and recommended immediate implementation of protective measures. Yet workers received no information about these findings or the recommended changes. Grace Fryer had continued organizing meetings among affected workers, and their informal network had grown to include women from factories in other states. Through correspondence and occasional visits, they had documented identical health problems among radium dial painters throughout the country. The consistency of symptoms across different locations strengthened their conviction that radium exposure was causing their illnesses. The legal implications of their situation became clearer when Catherine contacted attorney Leonard Grossman, who specialized in workplace injury cases. Grossman's initial assessment proved sobering. He explained that proving corporate liability for occupational illness required extensive medical evidence and expert testimony that might be difficult to obtain. Companies typically argued that worker health problems resulted from pre-existing conditions or lifestyle factors unrelated to employment. Grossman also warned that the radium industry wielded considerable political influence due to its importance for national defense and medical applications. Challenging such companies would require substantial financial resources and the willingness to endure prolonged legal battles against well-funded opponents. Many attorneys would be reluctant to accept cases with uncertain outcomes against powerful corporate interests. Catherine's personal health continued to deteriorate despite her efforts to minimize exposure by avoiding the lip-pointing technique. Her anemia had worsened to the point where climbing stairs left her breathless, and her bone pain had become constant. Most troubling was the discovery of several loose teeth, a development that filled her with dread given what had happened to Molly Maggia. The company's response to worker health complaints had become increasingly defensive and legalistic. When Edna Hussman collapsed at her workstation due to severe anemia, company representatives suggested that her condition might be related to poor nutrition or personal habits rather than workplace exposure. They emphasized that medical examinations continued to show that most workers remained healthy. Catherine began to suspect that the company's medical examinations were deliberately designed to avoid detecting radium-related illness. The physicians focused on general appearance and weight while ignoring specific symptoms that workers reported. Blood tests were rarely performed, and dental examinations were not included in the standard screening protocol. Through her library research, Catherine discovered disturbing information about the radium industry's knowledge of health hazards. Scientific papers published in European journals described cases of radium poisoning among researchers and industrial workers. Some of these studies had been available for several years, suggesting that American companies might have been aware of potential dangers long before problems emerged among dial painters. The most damning evidence came from internal company documents that Catherine obtained through a sympathetic clerk in the corporate offices. These papers revealed that executives had discussed worker health problems in private correspondence while publicly maintaining that radium exposure was perfectly safe. The documents suggested a deliberate strategy to minimize legal liability by avoiding acknowledgement of workplace hazards. Catherine shared these discoveries with Grace Fryer and their growing network of affected workers. Despite the difficulties they would encounter, the evidence made them more determined to take legal action. They realized that their case might establish important precedents for workplace safety and corporate responsibility that could protect future generations of workers. The women decided to seek additional medical evidence by consulting independent specialists who had no financial ties to the radium industry. Dr. Harrison Martland, a pathologist at Newark City Hospital, agreed to examine several of the workers and conduct laboratory tests to determine whether their bodies contained elevated levels of radioactive materials. Dr. Martland's findings provided the scientific foundation they needed to challenge the company's claims. His tests revealed that the workers' bodies contained significant amounts of radium that continued to emit radiation years after their initial exposure. The radioactive material had accumulated in their bones and organs, causing ongoing cellular damage that explained their progressive health deterioration. Armed with this medical evidence, Catherine and her colleagues began preparing for what would become one of the most important workplace safety cases in American legal history. They understood that their battle would require not only legal expertise, but also public support to overcome the powerful interests arrayed against them. The glowing paint that had once seemed miraculous now represented betrayal and corporate callousness. Catherine realized that her personal struggle for justice had evolved into something much larger, a fight to establish the principle that workers had the right to know about workplace hazards and to receive protection from employers who prioritize profits over human safety. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the radium industry was beginning to crack, but Catherine knew that exposing the truth would require courage, persistence, and sacrifices that would test her resolve in ways she had never imagined. Dr. Harrison Martland's laboratory at Newark City Hospital became the epicenter of groundbreaking research that would revolutionize understanding of occupational radiation exposure. Catherine Wiley found herself at the forefront of medical history as one of the first documented cases of chronic radium poisoning in industrial workers. The pathologist's investigations required Catherine and her colleagues to undergo extensive testing procedures that were both invasive and emotionally challenging. Dr. Martland collected blood samples, bone marrow specimens, and tissue biopsies to document the physiological changes caused by radium exposure. Each test revealed additional evidence of the systematic damage that radioactive materials had inflicted on their bodies. The most dramatic demonstration of their contamination occurred when Dr. Martland used a newly developed instrument called an electroscope to measure the radioactivity present in their bodies. Catherine watched in fascination and horror as the device detected significant radiation levels in her breath, saliva, and even her clothing. The measurements proved that she had become a living source of radioactive contamination. Dr. Martland documented his findings with meticulous care, recognizing that his research would face intense scrutiny from the radium industry and skeptical medical colleagues. He photographed bone deterioration, recorded blood count abnormalities, and measured radiation levels with unprecedented precision. His laboratory notes would eventually become crucial evidence in legal proceedings against the United States Radium Corporation. The pathologist's research revealed that radium behaved differently in the human body than previously understood. Rather than being quickly eliminated like most foreign substances, radioactive radium accumulated in bone tissue where it continued to emit radiation for years. This internal contamination caused progressive damage to blood-forming organs and bone structure that explained the worker's deteriorating health. Catherine learned that her body would continue to be radioactive for the rest of her life. Dr. Martland explained that radium had a half-life of over 1,500 years, meaning that the radioactive material in her bones would remain dangerous for millennia. This revelation transformed her understanding of her situation from a temporary health crisis to a permanent condition that would affect her for decades. The scientific implications of Dr. Martland's research extended far beyond the immediate case of the dial painters. His work provided the first comprehensive documentation of chronic radiation exposure in humans, establishing principles that would later guide radiation safety regulations in nuclear industries. The tragic experience of Catherine and her colleagues contributed to knowledge that would protect future generations of workers. Dr. Martland's findings attracted attention from researchers around the world who recognized the significance of his discoveries. International medical journals began publishing his studies, and scientists from various countries requested additional information about the dial painters' cases. Catherine realized that her personal struggle had become part of a global effort to understand radiation's effects on human health. The company's response to Dr. Martland's research proved predictably hostile. Corporate attorneys attempted to discredit his methodology and question his qualifications, despite his impeccable credentials and careful documentation. They argued that his findings might be influenced by bias toward the workers or desire for publicity rather than objective scientific inquiry. Industry representatives also challenged the connection between workplace exposure and worker illness, suggesting that the health problems might result from other factors. They cited medical opinions from company-affiliated physicians who maintained that radium exposure remained safe within established limits. These conflicting expert opinions created confusion that benefited the company's legal position. Catherine began to understand the broader implications of her case for industrial medicine and worker protection. The legal system's traditional approach to occupational illness required workers to prove that their employers had been negligent or had violated established safety standards. However, radium's dangers had been largely unknown when she began working at the factory, complicating efforts to establish corporate liability. Dr. Martland's research also revealed disturbing information about the company's knowledge of radium hazards. His investigation uncovered evidence that corporate officials had been aware of potential health risks much earlier than they had publicly acknowledged. Internal documents suggested that safety precautions had been implemented for executives and laboratory personnel, while production workers continued their exposure without protection. The pathologist's work attracted support from other medical professionals who recognized the importance of his research. Dr. Alice Hamilton, a pioneer in occupational medicine, praised his scientific rigor and endorsed his conclusions about radium's dangers. Her support lent credibility to the workers' claims and helped counter industry attempts to discredit the research. Catherine found herself becoming an advocate for industrial safety reform beyond her personal legal case. She began speaking to women's organizations and labor groups about the importance of workplace health protection. Her first-hand experience with corporate deception and medical cover-ups gave her testimony emotional power that resonated with audiences concerned about worker welfare. The scientific evidence accumulated by Dr. Martland provided the foundation for broader reforms in industrial hygiene and occupational medicine. His work demonstrated the need for independent medical monitoring of workers exposed to potentially hazardous materials and established principles for evaluating long-term health effects of industrial chemicals. Catherine's transformation from naive factory worker to informed advocate reflected broader changes in American society's understanding of industrial responsibility and worker rights. Her case would contribute to legal precedents that expanded corporate liability for occupational illness and established workers' rights to information about workplace hazards. The glowing legacy of her exposure to radium had evolved from personal tragedy to scientific breakthrough that would protect countless future workers from similar dangers. Catherine began to see her suffering as meaningful if it prevented other young women from experiencing the deception and health destruction that she and her colleagues had endured.
The afternoon heat of August 20th, 1966 pressed down on the Vintem Hill like a suffocating blanket. 18-year-old Jorge da Costa Alves had come to the remote area outside Rio de Janeiro, hoping to catch a few birds, a simple weekend pursuit that would forever alter his understanding of the world's mysteries. As he climbed the rocky outcropping, roughly 35 kilometers from the bustling city centre, Jorge expected nothing more than the familiar sounds of nature and perhaps a successful hunt. What he discovered instead would haunt Brazilian investigators for decades and spawn countless theories ranging from the plausible to the utterly bizarre. There, lying side by side in a small clearing near the summit, were two men in business suits. At first glance, Jorge assumed he'd stumbled upon a tragic accident or perhaps the aftermath of violence. But as he approached cautiously, the scene revealed details that defied easy explanation. Both men appeared to be in their 40s, well dressed in dark suits despite the remote location. Each wore identical lead masks, crude, handmade eye coverings that seemed more suited to a welder's workshop than a hiking expedition. The masks weren't commercial products but rather makeshift constructions, fashioned from thin sheets of lead with rough eye holes cut out. Their positioning was eerily deliberate, lying flat on their backs, arms at their sides, as if they had arranged themselves for some unknown ritual. Beside the bodies, Jorge noticed a small piece of paper, carefully folded and placed where it couldn't be missed. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. 1630, be at agreed place. 1830, swallow capsules. After effect, protect metals. Await signal mask. The cryptic message raised more questions than it answered, written in Portuguese, but with an oddly formal tone that suggested either careful planning or perhaps translation from another language. The police arrived within hours of Jorge's panicked report, but the scene they encountered challenged every investigative protocol they knew. Detective Inspector Wilson Pedrosa, a 20-year veteran of Rio's police force, had seen countless crime scenes, but this one felt different from the moment he crested the hill. The formal arrangement of the bodies, the identical masks, the mysterious note, everything suggested a level of organisation that contradicted the remote, seemingly random location. Initial examination revealed no obvious signs of violence. There were no bullet wounds, stab marks, or signs of a struggle. The men's clothing was neat and undisturbed, their wallets intact with identification that would soon lead investigators into an even deeper puzzle. Manuel Pereira de Cruz, 32, was an electronic technician from Campos dos Goitacazes. Miguel José Viana, 34, worked as an engineer in the same region, roughly 300 kilometers north of Rio. Tracing the final movements of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana proved as perplexing as the discovery itself. The investigation into their last known activities revealed a carefully orchestrated journey that began 3 days before their bodies were found on Vintem Hill. What emerged was a pattern of deliberate misdirection and secretive behaviour that suggested the two men were involved in something far more complex than their families had imagined. On August 17th, both men had told their wives they were travelling to São Paulo on business, a plausible explanation given their technical professions and the frequent need for specialists to consult on projects in Brazil's industrial centre. Manuel had even specified he would be examining electronic equipment for a potential client, while Miguel mentioned consulting on an engineering project. Their families had no reason to doubt these explanations, as both men occasionally travelled for work. However, investigators quickly discovered that neither man had any scheduled business in São Paulo. Their employers confirmed no work-related travel had been authorised, and no clients in São Paulo had requested their services. The business trip was an elaborate fiction, constructed to provide cover for their actual destination and purpose. Railway records showed the two men had indeed travelled together, but not to São Paulo. They had purchased tickets to Niterói, just across Guanabara Bay from Rio de Janeiro. Station attendants remembered them partly because of their formal business attire, unusual for tourists visiting the coastal region. They had carried a small suitcase between them and appeared to be consulting notes or documents during the journey. In Niterói, the trail became more complex. Hotel registrations showed they had checked into separate accommodations despite travelling together, another unusual detail that suggested either caution or perhaps instructions from an unknown third party. The hotel clerk at Manuel's lodging recalled the guest asking specific questions about local electronics shops, particularly those that might sell specialised components or materials. This inquiry led investigators to a small electronics supplier where both men had visited on August 18th. The shop owner, Carlos Mendes, remembered them clearly because of their unusual request. They had purchased several items that seemed unrelated to conventional electronics work, sheets of thin lead, basic tools for metalworking, and what Mendes described as materials for making something, not repairing something. When asked about their project, Miguel had mentioned they were constructing protective equipment for an experiment involving electromagnetic fields. The shop owner found this explanation vague but not entirely implausible, given the increasing interest in radio technology and electronic communications. Both men seemed knowledgeable about electronics, asking informed questions about conductivity and shielding properties. More intriguing was their inquiry about local geography. They had asked Carlos Mendes about elevated areas around Niterói and Rio, specifically locations that might offer clear sight lines and minimal interference from urban electrical systems. Mendes had mentioned several possibilities, including Vintem Hill, describing it as isolated but accessible for those willing to hike. The evening of August 18th marked the last confirmed sighting of both men alive. They had dined separately at their respective hotels, but both had asked their desk clerks about transportation to remote areas. Manuel had specifically inquired about reaching locations away from city lights and electrical interference. Miguel had asked about areas suitable for observational activities. Both men had paid their hotel bills in advance for 3 nights, despite checking out after only 2. This suggested they had planned to return, contradicting theories that they had travelled to Rio with suicidal intentions. Their behaviour indicated expectation of survival and return to their normal lives. Reconstruction of their final day revealed careful preparation. On the morning of August 19th, they had purchased supplies including water, basic food, and what appeared to be small glass vials from a pharmacy. The pharmacist remembered Miguel asking about storage of light-sensitive materials, requesting dark glass containers that would protect contents from sunlight. Most puzzling was a conversation overheard by another hotel guest. Through thin walls, the guest had heard one of the men, he couldn't determine which, speaking quietly but urgently into a telephone. The fragments he remembered were tantalizing, references to confirmation of coordinates, weather conditions favourable, and proceeding as discussed. The phone records from both hotels showed no outgoing calls charged to either room, suggesting they had used public phones or had been called by someone else. This detail pointed to coordination with outside parties, individuals who remained completely unknown to investigators. Their journey from Niteroi to Vintem Hill on August 19th left no clear trail. No taxi drivers came forward. No bus conductors remembered them. Somehow, two men in business suits carrying a suitcase and wearing homemade lead masks had reached one of the most isolated spots in the Rio metropolitan area, without leaving witnesses or evidence of their transportation method. The final piece of their journey remained as mysterious as their ultimate purpose on that desolate hilltop. Inspector Wilson Pedrosa had investigated hundreds of deaths during his career, but the lead mask's case challenged every investigative instinct he'd developed. As the initial findings rolled in from the forensic team, each piece of evidence seemed to deepen the mystery rather than illuminate it. The autopsy results, when they finally arrived, raised more questions about the nature of the two men's deaths and the circumstances that had brought them to Vintem Hill. The medical examiner, Dr. Antonio Rodriguez, was a methodical professional who rarely expressed puzzlement about his findings, but the condition of Manuel and Miguel's bodies presented several anomalies that defied easy medical explanation. First, despite the August heat and exposure, the bodies showed remarkably little decomposition. These features suggested either a very recent death or exposure to conditions that had somehow preserved the remains. What was even more perplexing was the complete absence of an obvious cause of death. Preliminary toxicology screens revealed no signs of trauma, wounds, or poisoning. Both men appeared to have simply stopped living, as if some internal switch had been turned off. Their faces, visible beneath the lead masks, showed no expression of pain or distress. If anything, they looked peaceful, almost serene. The toxicology results, however, would take weeks to complete, and Dr. Rodriguez warned that detecting certain substances, particularly exotic compounds or drugs not commonly seen in Brazil, might prove difficult with 1966 laboratory capabilities. He had collected extensive tissue samples, hoping that more sophisticated analysis might eventually reveal what had caused two apparently healthy men to die simultaneously. Meanwhile, Inspector Pedrosa focused on the physical evidence found at the scene. The lead masks themselves were clearly homemade, but their construction showed surprising sophistication. Someone with metalworking knowledge had carefully shaped the lead sheets to fit human faces, creating eye holes positioned precisely for normal vision. The quality suggested either practice in such construction or perhaps guidance from someone with relevant expertise. The mysterious note continued to baffle investigators. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was written by Miguel José Viana, but the formal language and specific terminology seemed uncharacteristic of his usual writing style, based on samples obtained from his employer and family. The phrase, "after effect protect metals awaits signal mask," particularly puzzled linguistic experts consulted by the police. The reference to capsules mentioned in the note became more significant when investigators discovered the small glass vials purchased from the Niteroi pharmacy. Investigators found these empty capsules near the bodies, carefully placing them beside the mysterious note. Whatever the capsules had contained was gone, either consumed as the note suggested, or removed by unknown parties before the bodies were discovered. Inspector Pedrosa also grappled with the question of timing. The note specified activities at 1630 and 1830, but determining when these events had actually occurred proved impossible. Weather conditions, decomposition rates, and witness statements provided only rough estimates. The men could have died on August 19th as suggested, or perhaps even earlier, complicating efforts to establish a timeline. The investigation expanded to include interviews with family members, colleagues, and friends of both victims. These conversations revealed that both Manuel and Miguel had been acting somewhat unusually in the weeks before their deaths. Colleagues described them as distracted, occasionally discussing topics outside their normal professional interests. Investigators observed both Manuel and Miguel reading materials about electronics and radio technology, albeit in contexts that appeared more theoretical than practical. Manel's wife mentioned that he had been receiving mail from unknown correspondents, letters that he would read privately and then carefully store away. However, investigators could not find these letters when they searched his home. Either Manuel had destroyed them or someone had removed them after his departure for what his family believed was a business trip to São Paulo. Miguel's behaviour had been equally puzzling to those who knew him well. His supervisor at work remembered him asking questions about electromagnetic interference and its effects on human physiology, topics that had no connection to his normal engineering responsibilities. He had also inquired about obtaining materials for experimental work, though he never specified the nature of these experiments. Both men had apparently developed an interest in what one colleague described as invisible forces, electromagnetic fields, radio waves, and atmospheric phenomena that couldn't be seen but could potentially affect human health or consciousness. This interest seemed to have emerged suddenly over the course of just a few months before their deaths. The investigation also revealed that neither man had any known connection to occult practices, religious extremism, or political activities that might explain their presence on Vindhem Hill. They were ordinary technical professionals who had somehow become involved in extraordinary circumstances that cost them their lives. As weeks passed, Inspector Pedrosa found himself with more questions than answers, facing a case that seemed to resist conventional investigative approaches. Theories about the events on Vindhem Hill proliferated rapidly as news of the lead masks case spread throughout Brazil and eventually internationally. Inspector Pedrosa found himself fielding calls from journalists, amateur investigators, and self-proclaimed experts, each offering explanations that ranged from the scientifically plausible to the utterly fantastic. Every conceivable theory about the two men's deaths flourished due to the lack of concrete evidence and the mysterious circumstances surrounding their deaths. The most conventional theory focused on suicide, suggesting that Manuel and Miguel had entered into some form of death pact. Proponents of this explanation pointed to the careful planning evident in their journey, the deliberate positioning of their bodies, and the formal tone of the note as evidence of premeditated self-destruction. However, this theory struggled to explain the lead masks, the reference to awaiting a signal, or the technical language about protecting metals. Dr. Helena Santos, a psychiatrist consulted by the police, offered a more nuanced psychological perspective. She suggested the men might have been suffering from shared delusional disorder, a rare condition where closely associated individuals develop similar false beliefs. In this scenario, both men might have become convinced they needed protection from some imaginary threat, hence the lead masks, and had taken substances they believed would help them survive some perceived danger. The toxicology angle attracted significant attention from medical professionals. Dr. Rodriguez eventually confirmed the presence of digitalis in both bodies, a compound derived from foxglove plants that affects heart rhythm. However, the levels detected were not necessarily fatal, and digitalis had legitimate medical uses that either man might have had access to. Whether the substance represented the capsules mentioned in the note remained unclear. More exotic theories began emerging from Brazil's growing interest in space exploration and UFO phenomena. The 1960s had seen increased public fascination with extraterrestrial life, partly fueled by the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Some theorists suggested that Manuel and Miguel had been attempting to make contact with alien visitors, using the lead masks to protect themselves from harmful radiation while awaiting some form of otherworldly signal. This extraterrestrial hypothesis gained traction when investigators discovered that both men had been reading science fiction magazines and had shown interest in reports of unidentified flying objects. Several witnesses in the Vindhem Hill area reported seeing strange lights in the sky around the time of the deaths, though these accounts couldn't be verified and might have been influenced by publicity surrounding the case. Electronics engineer Dr. Fernando Lima proposed a more scientific but equally intriguing theory. He suggested the men might have been conducting unauthorized experiments with electromagnetic fields or radio frequency emissions. The lead masks could have been primitive protection against electromagnetic radiation, while their death might have resulted from exposure to dangerous levels of electrical or radio energy generated by homemade equipment. This theory gained some credibility when investigators learned that both victims had been asking colleagues about high-voltage electrical systems and electromagnetic shielding. However, investigators found no experimental equipment at the scene, and neither man had the resources to construct devices capable of generating lethal electromagnetic fields. Religious and occult explanations also emerged, despite the victims' apparent lack of involvement in such practices. Some suggested that the victims had been engaged in spiritual experiments aimed at achieving out-of-body experiences or contact with supernatural entities. The formal language of the note, with its references to specific timing and protective measures, resembled ritual instructions found in certain esoteric traditions. Professor Carlos Andrade, an anthropologist studying Brazilian folk religions, noted similarities between the lead masks case and certain African-derived spiritual practices that had taken root in Brazil. Some traditions involved the use of protective amulets and specific timing for spiritual communications. However, lead masks were not part of any known Brazilian religious practice, and both men's families insisted they had no involvement with such beliefs. Industrial espionage theories suggested the men might have been involved in stealing or selling technical secrets, with their deaths resulting from a deal gone wrong. The cover story of a business trip, the secretive behaviour, and their technical expertise all supported this possibility. However, investigators found no evidence of valuable information being stolen from their employers, nor any indication they had been in contact with foreign agents or industrial competitors. Perhaps the most persistent theory involved government conspiracy, suggesting that Manuel and Miguel had stumbled upon classified military experiments or had been eliminated to prevent them from revealing state secrets. Brazil's military government in 1966 was indeed conducting various research projects, and the formal language of the note resembled military communications protocols. However, extensive investigation revealed no government connection to either man, and military officials denied any involvement in activities that might have led to their deaths. The theory persisted largely because of its explanatory power rather than supporting evidence. Each theory offered partial explanations for some aspects of the case, while failing to account for others, leaving the mystery as perplexing as ever. 6 months after the discovery on Vintem Hill, Inspector Pedrosa received an unexpected visitor who would introduce an entirely new dimension to the lead masks case. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a visiting researcher from the University of São Paulo's physics department, had been following the investigation through newspaper reports and believed she might offer insights that had been overlooked by conventional criminal investigation. Dr. Vasquez specialized in atmospheric physics and electromagnetic phenomena, fields that were rapidly expanding in the 1960s as scientists began to understand the complex interactions between Earth's magnetic field, solar radiation, and human-made electrical systems. Her interest in the lead masks case had been piqued by the victims' apparent concern with protecting metals and their use of lead shielding, details that suggested knowledge of electromagnetic principles. Inspector, Dr. Vasquez explained during their first meeting, what if these men weren't protecting themselves from earthly dangers, but from something in the atmosphere itself? She had brought a collection of scientific journals and research papers, which illustrated the growing awareness about electromagnetic hazards in the mid-1960s. The timing of the deaths, she noted, coincided with a period of unusual solar activity. Solar flares and magnetic storms in August 1966 had been significant enough to disrupt radio communications across South America. Amateur radio operators had reported strange interference patterns, and several commercial airlines had experienced navigation difficulties attributed to electromagnetic disturbances. More intriguing was Dr. Vasquez's discovery that both Manuel and Miguel had been corresponding with amateur radio enthusiasts in the months before their deaths. Through careful investigation of radio operator networks, she had uncovered evidence that both men had been asking questions about electromagnetic shielding and the biological effects of radio frequency exposure. The physics professor had also identified what she believed might be the source of the victims' information about electromagnetic dangers. A series of articles published in technical magazines during early 1966 had discussed theoretical risks associated with high-altitude electromagnetic experiments being conducted by various governments. While much of this information was speculative or even sensationalized, it could have influenced technically trained individuals to take protective measures. Consider the lead masks not as protection from aliens or government rays, Dr. Vasquez suggested, but as crude Faraday cages designed to shield their brains from electromagnetic interference. The positioning on a hilltop, away from urban electrical systems, makes sense if they were trying to avoid electromagnetic pollution while exposing themselves to natural atmospheric phenomena. This electromagnetic theory provided new context for the mysterious note. The reference to awaiting a signal could have meant monitoring for specific electromagnetic events, perhaps solar flare activity or atmospheric electrical phenomena that both men believed required protective observation. The timing specified in the note might have corresponded to predicted periods of electromagnetic activity. Dr. Vasquez had researched historical records and discovered that August 20th, 1966, had indeed featured unusual atmospheric electrical activity. Lightning detectors across the Rio region had recorded abnormal patterns, and several amateur meteorologists had noted strange cloud formations that might have indicated electromagnetic disturbances in the upper atmosphere. The capsules mentioned in the note took on new significance under this electromagnetic theory. Dr. Vasquez suggested they might have contained substances believed to protect against radiation exposure, perhaps iodine compounds or other materials that amateur scientists in the 1960s sometimes used as protection against various forms of radiation. Further investigation revealed that both men had been members of amateur science clubs that discussed topics ranging from radio astronomy to atmospheric phenomena. These groups, while not formally organized, exchanged information through correspondence networks that connected technically minded individuals across Brazil. Some members had become convinced that government and military electromagnetic experiments posed health risks to civilian populations. The electromagnetic theory also explained the victims' interest in elevated locations with clear sight lines. If they were attempting to observe or measure atmospheric electromagnetic phenomena, a hilltop position would provide optimal conditions while minimizing interference from urban electrical systems. The remote location of Vintem Hill suddenly made sense as a scientific observation point rather than a meeting place for mysterious activities. Dr. Vasquez had even identified similar cases from other countries where amateur scientists had attempted to study electromagnetic phenomena using crude protective equipment. While none had resulted in deaths, several incidents involved individuals taking substantial risks based on incomplete understanding of electromagnetic hazards. However, the electromagnetic theory still couldn't fully explain how both men had died. Even if they had exposed themselves to dangerous electromagnetic fields, the medical evidence didn't clearly support electromagnetic radiation as a cause of death. The absence of burns, cellular damage, or other indicators of electromagnetic exposure remained problematic. Nevertheless, Dr. Vasquez's research had paved the way for further investigation and provided the first scientifically grounded explanation for many previously inexplicable aspects of the case. The lead mask case was beginning to look less like a criminal mystery and more like a scientific tragedy. A startling discovery was made by construction workers building a new radio transmission tower in the area, nearly 2 years after the discovery on Vintem Hill, turning the lead mask's case in an unexpected direction. Buried approximately 50 meters from where the bodies had been found, they uncovered a metal container that had been carefully hidden beneath rocks and soil. The container's contents would provide the most significant breakthrough in the investigation since the initial discovery. Inspector Pedrosa, now nearing retirement but still haunted by the unsolved case, was called to examine the find. The container was a waterproof aluminum box, the type used by amateur radio operators to protect sensitive equipment from moisture and electromagnetic interference. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, were documents that immediately connected to Manuel and Miguel's final journey. The first document was a detailed, hand-drawn map of the Vintem Hill area, with specific locations marked and numbered. The spot where the bodies were found was clearly indicated, along with several other positions that appeared to represent observation points or equipment placement sites. Compass bearings and distance measurements covered the margins, suggesting careful surveying of the terrain. More revealing were the technical diagrams and calculations that filled several pages. These showed sophisticated understanding of electromagnetic field patterns, antenna design, and atmospheric electrical phenomena. While the handwriting was difficult to identify definitively, The technical knowledge displayed was consistent with both men's professional backgrounds. Perhaps most important was a series of letters between the victims and an individual identified only as Dr. A . These correspondence pieces, dating from early 1966 through just days before the deaths, revealed a relationship with someone who appeared to be coordinating the activities that led to Vintem Hill. Dr. A provided detailed instructions about timing, equipment preparation, and safety procedures that directly corresponded to the mysterious note found with the bodies. The letters revealed that Manuel and Miguel had been recruited for what Dr. A described as an atmospheric electrical monitoring experiment of national importance. They were told that their technical skills made them ideal candidates for collecting data on electromagnetic phenomena that government agencies were allegedly unable to study openly due to international agreements restricting such research. Dr. A's correspondence demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of electromagnetic theory and atmospheric physics. The letters included detailed explanations of how solar activity affected Earth's magnetic field, how these interactions created measurable electromagnetic pulses, and why such measurements required protection from electromagnetic interference, hence the lead masks and elevated observation position. The safety instructions were particularly chilling in retrospect. Dr. A had outlined specific protocols to safeguard against electromagnetic overload during peak atmospheric electrical events. The lead masks were identified as essential protection for the brain, which was supposedly vulnerable to electromagnetic disruption during periods of high atmospheric electrical activity. Most disturbing was a letter dated just 3 days before the deaths, in which Dr. A provided final instructions, including the precise timing and protective measures that appeared in the note found with the bodies. This letter also mentioned observation enhancement compounds that would help the subjects maintain focus during the critical observation period, almost certainly referring to the capsules mentioned in the final note. The buried container also included technical equipment that hadn't been found with the bodies, a sophisticated radio receiver modified for monitoring atmospheric electromagnetic activity, several measuring instruments, and what appeared to be a primitive electromagnetic field detector. This equipment represented a significant investment and suggested the involvement of someone with substantial resources and technical expertise. Inspector Pedrosa immediately began trying to identify Dr. A, but the letters provided few concrete clues about the person's identity or location. The letterhead was generic, the postmarks were smudged or illegible, and the writing style was formal and impersonal. However, the level of technical knowledge suggested someone with advanced education in physics or electrical engineering. Interviews with colleagues and family members of both victims revealed that neither had mentioned working with anyone identified as Dr. A, though both had referred vaguely to consulting work and special projects in the months before their deaths. This implied that they had conducted their relationship with Dr. A in secrecy, possibly under instructions not to discuss the work with others. The discovery of the buried container fundamentally changed the investigation's direction. Rather than focusing on the mysterious circumstances of the deaths themselves, investigators now had evidence of a larger conspiracy involving at least one other individual who had directed the victims' activities. The lead masks case was no longer just about two men who had died mysteriously on a hilltop. It was about someone who had orchestrated their presence there. However, identifying and locating Dr. A would prove to be even more challenging than explaining the original mystery, opening new questions about the true scope and purpose of whatever experiment had cost Manuel and Miguel their lives. 5 decades have passed since Jorge da Costa Alves discovered 2 men in lead masks on Vintem Hill, yet the case continues to generate interest and controversy among investigators, researchers, and mystery enthusiasts worldwide. Despite extensive investigation, advances in forensic science, and numerous theories proposed by experts in fields ranging from toxicology to electromagnetic physics, the fundamental questions surrounding the deaths of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana remain unanswered. The search for the mysterious Dr. A consumed considerable investigative resources throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. Inspector Pedrosa, working with federal authorities and international police agencies, pursued hundreds of leads without ever definitively identifying the person who had apparently orchestrated the events leading to the deaths. Several individuals with the necessary technical knowledge were investigated, but none could be conclusively linked to the correspondence found in the buried container. One promising lead involved a former university professor who had left Brazil abruptly in late 1966, but efforts to locate him in various South American countries proved unsuccessful. Another investigation focused on a group of amateur scientists who had been conducting unauthorized radio experiments, but their activities, while suspicious, couldn't be directly connected to the Vintem Hill incident. The case attracted international attention, partly because of its unique combination of mystery and scientific intrigue. During the height of the Cold War, when both superpowers were conducting classified research into electromagnetic weapons and atmospheric phenomena, the lead mask's case seemed to offer tantalizing hints about secret experiments that might have gone tragically wrong. UFO researchers jumped on the case as possible proof of contact with aliens, pointing out the use of electromagnetic protection, the isolated location, and the mention of waiting for a signal as signs of trying to reach out to extraterrestrials. While this theory gained popular attention, it couldn't account for the human manipulation evident in Dr. A's correspondence with the victims. Modern analysis of the physical evidence has provided some additional insights while raising new questions. Advanced toxicology techniques have confirmed the presence of several compounds in tissue samples preserved from the original investigation, but their significance remains unclear. Some appear to be naturally occurring substances that could have been consumed as herbal preparations, while others might represent environmental contamination or preservation artifacts. Computer analysis of the electromagnetic data collected by researchers in 1966 has revealed that the timing specified in the victim's note corresponded to a period of unusual electromagnetic activity. However, whether the finding represents coincidence or evidence that Dr. A possessed sophisticated knowledge of atmospheric electrical patterns remains disputed. The lead masks themselves have been subjected to extensive analysis by materials scientists and metallurgists. Their construction demonstrates considerable skill and suggests access to specialized tools and techniques. The lead used appears to have been sourced from industrial suppliers, but efforts to trace its origin have been unsuccessful due to incomplete records from the 1960s. Perhaps most frustrating for investigators has been the complete absence of additional evidence linking to Dr. A or explaining the broader context of whatever experiment was being conducted. Despite intensive searches of the Vintem Hill area using ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment, no additional buried containers or equipment caches have been discovered. The case has influenced popular culture, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and fictional adaptations. However, media attention has also contributed to the spread of unsubstantiated theories and false information that has complicated serious investigation. Distinguishing between legitimate evidence and sensationalized speculation remains challenging for researchers approaching the case today. From a scientific perspective, the lead mask's case represents an intriguing example of how incomplete understanding of electromagnetic phenomena in the 1960s might have led technically trained individuals to take dangerous protective measures. The era's growing awareness of electromagnetic hazards, combined with limited public access to authoritative information, created conditions where well-intentioned but misguided experiments could have tragic consequences. The psychological aspects of the case continue to fascinate researchers studying group dynamics and shared belief systems. The apparent willingness of two rational, technically competent individuals to participate in potentially dangerous activities based on instructions from an unknown correspondent raises questions about persuasion, authority, and the influence of technical expertise on decision-making. Today, the lead mask's case stands as one of Brazil's most enduring mysteries, representing the intersection of science, mystery, and human tragedy. While modern investigative techniques and scientific knowledge provide new tools for analysis, the passage of time has also meant the loss of potential witnesses and the degradation of physical evidence. The case serves as a reminder that even in our interconnected, information-rich modern world, it remains possible for individuals to become involved in activities that are never fully understood or explained. Somewhere in the hills outside Rio de Janeiro, the truth about what happened on August 20th, 1966 may still be waiting to be discovered, buried as carefully as the metal container that provided the investigation's most significant breakthrough. The mystery endures as compelling today as it was nearly 60 years ago. You're settling in for the night, maybe with a cup of chamomile tea or that last bit of wine from dinner, and your mind starts wandering to one of history's most frustrating puzzles. Not the kind that keeps you up staring at the ceiling, more like the kind that makes you feel pleasantly drowsy while your brain does that gentle tumbling thing it does when it's processing something intriguing but not urgent. The lost colony of Roanoke. Over the years, you've likely heard fragments of information about the lost colony of Roanoke, perhaps seen a documentary about it, or come across a mention in some historical fiction. But there's something deliciously unsettling about the whole thing that makes it perfect for this quiet moment before sleep. Not scary, unsettling. More like the feeling you get when you realise you've misplaced your reading glasses and then spend 10 minutes looking for them while they're sitting on top of your head. Picture this. It's 1587, and you're part of a group of English settlers heading to what would eventually become North Carolina. You're probably wearing uncomfortable clothes, your teeth could use some serious dental work, and the boat ride has been exactly as pleasant as you'd expect from a 16th century ocean voyage. But you're hopeful. You're starting fresh in a new world, building something from scratch, maybe leaving behind some drama or debt or just the general stuffiness of Elizabethan England. Your leader is a fellow named John White. Not the most charismatic name in history, admittedly, but he seems decent enough. He's actually an artist, which is rather sweet when you think about it. Rather than a stern military leader, you have someone who observes the way light interacts with water and likely enjoys sketching birds in his free time. White has been to this area before, so he knows the territory, sort of. Well, he thinks he does. The plan is straightforward. Establish a colony, grow some crops, trade with the local Croatoan people who seem reasonably friendly, and eventually create a thriving English settlement. Simple enough, right? You've brought families this time, men, women, children, even a pregnant woman named Eleanor, who happens to be John White's daughter. This is not an expedition filled with soldiers and fortune seekers. This town is meant to be a real community, with people planning to put down roots and build actual lives. And for a little while, things go okay. Not great. Nothing ever goes great when you're essentially camping in the wilderness while trying to construct civilization from scratch. But okay, you build some houses, plant some gardens, and meet some neighbours. Eleanor gives birth to a little girl named Virginia Dare, who becomes the first English child born in North America. There's something both hopeful and slightly ominous about that distinction, though you don't know it yet. But then problems start cropping up, the way they always do when people are stressed and living in close quarters with limited resources. Food supplies are running lower than expected. Some of the neighbouring indigenous groups are less welcoming than hoped, partly because previous English visitors hadn't exactly been model guests. There are misunderstandings, tensions, and the occasional skirmish. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make everyone a bit jumpy. John White finds himself in an impossible position. The colony needs supplies, food, tools, medicine, all the things you can't exactly improvise in the wilderness. Someone has to go back to England to get help, and the leader is obviously him. But leaving means abandoning his daughter and brand new granddaughter, along with everyone else who's counting on him. It's the kind of decision that would give anyone stress dreams. Stay and watch everyone slowly starve, or get picked off by various dangers, or leave and hope you can make it back before something terrible happens. White chooses to leave, promising to return as quickly as possible with supplies and reinforcements. As his ship disappears over the horizon, you're left standing on the shore with about 115 other colonists, watching your lifeline sail away. The ocean looks huge suddenly, and England feels very far away. But you're committed now. This is home, for better or worse. You settle into a routine of sorts, tending crops, maintaining buildings, and trying to establish better relationships with your neighbours. Days pass, then weeks, then months. Winter comes and goes. Spring arrives. You keep expecting to see ships on the horizon, but the horizon remains stubbornly empty. One day you come to a startling realization. John White has been gone for nearly 3 years. Where is he? 3 years. You've been counting. because it helps maintain the illusion that time is still moving in a predictable way, that there's still a connection to the world you came from. 3 years since you watched John White's ship disappear, taking with it your main link to supplies, reinforcements, and news from home. At first, everyone had reasonable explanations for the delay. Ocean voyages were unpredictable: storms, pirates, navigation errors, and mechanical problems. Ships sank with depressing regularity in those days. Maybe White's vessel had been damaged and needed extensive repairs. Maybe he'd had trouble convincing investors to fund a return voyage. Maybe Queen Elizabeth had other priorities. There were always wars or political crises or economic troubles that could divert attention and resources. You'd developed little rituals around watching for ships. Someone would climb the tallest tree each morning to scan the horizon. Others would take evening walks along the beach, squinting at distant clouds that might, from the right angle and with enough wishful thinking, look like sails. Children made games of it, competing to be the first to spot the rescue ships that never came. But as months stretched into years, those hopeful habits began to feel hollow. The morning tree climbing became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Beach walks continued, but more for exercise and contemplation than for ship spotting. The children found other games. During this endless waiting period, you've learned things about yourself and your fellow colonists that you never expected to discover. You've learned that Margaret Harrison has an absolutely filthy sense of humour when she thinks no one important is listening. You've discovered that Thomas Cooper, who seemed like such a practical, level-headed fellow back in England, becomes completely irrational when he can't find his favourite hammer. You've watched Eleanor White Dare transform from a nervous new mother into someone who could probably run a small government if necessary. The colony has developed its own rhythms, its own internal politics, and its own little dramas and alliances. People have paired off, broken up, reconciled, argued over garden boundaries, shared recipes, borrowed tools, and gossiped about each other's laundry habits. It's become a real community, which is both comforting and slightly tragic under the circumstances. Your relationship with the Croatoan people has evolved too, though it's complicated. Some individuals have been genuinely helpful, sharing knowledge about local plants, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. Others remain suspicious or hostile, and you can hardly blame them. Your presence represents a permanent change to their world, whether you intended it or not. The language barrier creates endless opportunities for misunderstandings, some amusing, and others less so. You've learned to recognize certain words and phrases, and developed a basic vocabulary of gestures and expressions that help with simple communications. But nuanced conversations remain nearly impossible, which means you're never quite sure where you stand with your neighbours. Food has become an ongoing source of low-level anxiety. You've learned to eat things you never imagined consuming: roots, berries, and various aquatic creatures that look like they belonged in a medieval bestiary rather than on a dinner plate. Some of these discoveries have been pleasant surprises. Others have been less pleasant. You've developed a healthy respect for the trial and error process of identifying edible plants, especially after Thomas Cooper's unfortunate encounter with what everyone now refers to as the incident with the purple berries. The seasons have become more meaningful than they ever were back in England. You notice changes in daylight, temperature, and weather patterns with the intensity of someone whose life actually depends on such things. You've learned to read the sky, to predict storms, and to recognize the subtle signs that indicate when to plant, when to harvest, and when to prepare for winter. Your sleeping patterns have changed too. Without candles to waste or oil lamps to maintain, you've fallen into a rhythm that follows natural light more closely. You sleep deeper and wake more naturally, though your dreams have become more vivid and sometimes strange. Maybe it's the diet, or the stress, or just the way your brain processes this surreal situation of being possibly forgotten by the entire civilized world. But the most unsettling realization is this: you've stopped talking about when the rescue ships arrive and started talking about if they arrive. It's a small change in language, but it represents a massive shift in thinking. You're no longer temporary residents waiting for transportation home. You're permanent settlers who may never see England again. The question that keeps surfacing, usually late at night, when you're lying awake listening to unfamiliar sounds in the darkness, is this: what happens if no one ever comes? By the 4th year, you've all implicitly accepted the reality that no one wants to publicly express. You're on your own. John White isn't coming back, at least not anytime soon, and possibly not ever. The reasons don't matter anymore. War, shipwreck, political upheaval, financial problems, or maybe he simply got distracted by some other opportunity. The result is the same either way. This realization has brought a strange kind of relief along with the obvious anxiety. The waiting is over. Certainty about abandonment has replaced the uncertainty about rescue, and working with certainty, even unpleasant certainty, is easier than endless hope. You can make plans now, real plans, instead of just marking time until someone else solves your problems. The colony's leadership has shifted subtly but noticeably. Without an appointed governor, decisions get made by consensus, argument, or sometimes just by whoever feels strongly enough about something to take charge. Eleanor White Dare has emerged as a natural leader, partly because she's John White's daughter, and partly because she's simply adept at organising people and resources. Her daughter Virginia, now a walking, talking 4-year-old, has become everyone's child, a living symbol of the colony's commitment to staying put. You've also had to confront some uncomfortable realities about your situation. Food security remains problematic. You've learned to cultivate local crops and preserve seasonal abundance, but you're always one disastrous harvest or severe winter away from serious trouble. The indigenous neighbours continue to be unpredictable, sometimes helpful, sometimes hostile, always operating according to social rules you don't fully understand. Your housing situation has evolved from temporary shelters to more permanent structures, but permanent is relative when you're working with local materials and limited tools. Roofs leak, walls warp, and foundations settle in unexpected ways. Everything requires constant maintenance, which might be normal for colonial life, but it feels particularly precarious when you realise there's no possibility of ordering replacement materials from England. Medical care has become a community responsibility handled by a combination of folk remedies, trial and error, and prayer. Margaret Harrison turned out to have a knack for healing, probably based on knowledge she'd picked up from her grandmother back home, combined with careful observation of what works and what doesn't. But serious injuries or illnesses remain terrifying because there's no doctor, no pharmacy, and no hospital within several thousand miles. The psychological adjustment has been harder than the practical challenges. You've grieved the life you left behind, not just the people and places, but the assumptions about how the world works. In England, you were part of a complex, established society with rules, institutions, and safety nets. Here, you're essentially making up civilization as you go along, which is both liberating and exhausting. Some colonists have adapted better than others. A few have thrived in this environment, discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed. Others have struggled with depression, anxiety, or what we might now recognise as PTSD from the constant stress of survival. There's been at least one suicide, and several people have simply wandered off into the wilderness, either deliberately or because they became confused and disoriented. But here's the thing that keeps you awake sometimes, staring up at stars that seem brighter and more numerous than they ever did back home. You've started to suspect that staying might not be entirely voluntary anymore. You've evolved in ways that could make reintegrating into English society challenging or unfeasible, not due to any external force holding you captive. You've learned to track animals, identify medicinal plants, predict weather patterns, and navigate by natural landmarks. You've developed relationships with people whose names you can't properly pronounce but whose faces have become as familiar as family. You've adapted to a rhythm of life that follows seasons rather than clocks and natural light rather than artificial schedules. Would you even fit back into English society now? Could you readjust to having neighbours you've never spoken to buying food instead of growing it, and to following laws made by people who live hundreds of miles away? Would people value the skills you've developed here, such as patience, resourcefulness, and the ability to find solutions using only what's immediately available? Or would they view them as eccentricities? And there's Virginia to consider. She's never known any world but this one. England would be as foreign to her as this place once was to you. She speaks English, but she also knows Croatoan words and gestures. She's equally comfortable with European games and indigenous traditions. She belongs here in a way that you're still learning. The question isn't just about survival anymore. It's about identity, belonging, and what home means when the place you came from is now more foreign than the one you've made. But the alternative, staying put and hoping tensions resolve themselves, feels increasingly unrealistic. There's been talk of violence, rumours of coordinated action against the colony, reports of weapons being gathered and alliances being formed. You don't know how much of this is accurate intelligence and how much is anxiety-fueled speculation, but you can't afford to assume the best-case scenario. The decision gets made gradually, then suddenly. Someone suggests that advanced scouts should visit Croatoan Island to assess the situation and begin negotiations. Someone else volunteers to start organising supplies for a potential move. A third person begins making lists of what's essential and what can be left behind. Before anyone officially declares that the colony is relocating, everyone's acting as if the decision has already been made. You find yourself caught up in the strange energy of dismantling a life you've spent years building. Possessions get sorted into piles. Absolutely necessary, probably useful, would be nice to have and might as well leave it. The process is both liberating and heartbreaking. You're shedding not just objects, but attachments, memories, the physical evidence of your attempts to create permanence in an impermanent world. Some colonists are handling the transition better than others. A few seem almost excited about the prospect of starting fresh somewhere new, treating it as an adventure rather than an evacuation. Others are clearly struggling with what feels like another abandonment, another failure to establish the stable community they'd hoped to create. There's grief mixed with the practical preparations, a sense of loss that nobody wants to dwell on, because dwelling on it might make the necessary action impossible. The children are adapting with the resilience that children somehow manage to summon for situations that would break most adults. Virginia Dare, now approaching her 5th birthday, treats the whole thing as an elaborate game of packing and unpacking, helping to sort items while chattering about the boat ride and the new place where they'll live. Her cheerfulness is both encouraging and slightly devastating. As departure day approaches, you realise you're about to become part of one of history's great mysteries, though you have no way of knowing that yet. You're just people trying to survive, making the best decisions you can with incomplete information and limited options. But someone, someday, is going to want to know what happened to you. You've left clues because you're not stupid. Despite the chaos and urgency of packing up an entire community, despite the stress of negotiating safe passage with people who speak a different language, despite the 100 practical concerns that come with essentially becoming refugees in your own adopted homeland, you've thought about the future. Specifically, you've thought about John White. He might still come back. Probably not, but possibly, and if he does, he's going to find an empty settlement with no indication of what happened to the people he left behind. That would be cruel, leaving him to imagine the worst: massacre, starvation, disease, or some other catastrophe that wiped out his daughter, granddaughter, and everyone else he'd sworn to protect. So, you've left messages. It's not just you alone, but a team of individuals collaborating to guarantee that any potential searchers will discover solutions rather than merely enigmas. The most obvious message is carved into a post near the fort. Croatoan. It's simple, clear, and should be understandable to anyone familiar with the area. If John White returns, he'll know you've gone to Croatoan Island, and he'll know you went there voluntarily rather than under duress. There's also another carving, just CRO, on a nearby tree. We added this one partly as a backup, and partly because Thomas Cooper became enthusiastic about the carving project and wanted to contribute his own handiwork. It's less informative than the main message, but it reinforces the direction you've gone. The plan was to include more detailed information, perhaps a letter left in a waterproof container, or additional carvings explaining the circumstances of your departure. But time ran out faster than expected. The situation with your neighbours deteriorated more quickly than anyone anticipated, and what was supposed to be a carefully planned relocation became something closer to an urgent evacuation. You'd also discussed establishing some kind of signal system, perhaps arrange stones or mark trees that could guide rescue parties from the original settlement to your new location. But again, the reality of moving over 100 people with limited transportation and uncertain welcome made such elaborate precautions impossible. The departure itself was both more and less dramatic than you'd imagined. More dramatic because loading people and supplies into small boats while everyone's nervous about potentially hostile observers creates a lot of tension and shouting. Less dramatic because it was mostly just logistics. Who sits where, which boxes go in which boat, and how to keep the children calm and the adults from panicking. Eleanor insisted on one last walk through the settlement before leaving, taking Virginia with her to see the place where she'd been born. It was both sentimental and practical, making sure nothing essential had been forgotten, saying goodbye to a place that had been home for several years, and creating a memory that Virginia might carry forward even if she never sees this spot again. You found yourself doing the same thing, taking a final inventory of the structures you'd helped build, the gardens you'd helped plant, and the improvements you'd made to what had been wilderness when you first arrived. It wasn't sentiment exactly, but it wasn't entirely practical either. Maybe it was just the human need to acknowledge the significance of endings, to mark the transition between one phase of life and whatever comes next. The boat ride to Croatoan Island was long enough to give everyone time to think about what they were leaving behind and what they might be heading toward. Some people spent the journey looking back at the coastline that had been home, watching it shrink into the distance. Others faced forward, trying to spot their destination and imagine what life might be like in their new location. A few just closed their eyes and tried not to think about anything at all. Virginia fell asleep in her mother's arms partway through the voyage, lulled by the motion of the boat and the sound of water against the hull. Watching her sleep, so completely trusting that the adults around her would handle whatever needed to be handled, you felt the weight of responsibility that comes with making decisions that will shape someone else's entire future. You have made every effort to create a trail that any reasonable search party could follow. You've chosen a destination that offers the best available chance for survival and prosperity. You've maintained the unity of the community despite stress and uncertainty. You've made the hard choices that needed to be made. But, as the familiar coastline disappears behind you and the unknown shoreline grows larger ahead, you can't shake the feeling that you're not just changing locations. You're disappearing from history, becoming part of a story that no one will ever be able to complete. The messages you left behind feel suddenly inadequate, too simple for the complexity of what's actually happening. Croatoan Island is both exactly what you expected and completely different from what you'd imagined. The physical landscape is familiar: sandy beaches, maritime forests, and the same plants and animals you'd learned to recognize over the past several years. But the social landscape is entirely new, and navigating it requires skills you're still developing. Though the term welcoming might be too strong, your hosts have been more welcoming than you'd dared to hope. Tolerant might be more accurate, or perhaps cautiously accommodating. While you negotiate longer-term arrangements, they've allowed you to establish temporary shelters and shared information about local resources, seasonal patterns, and potential hazards. But there's an underlying tension in these interactions, a sense that your presence here is provisional rather than permanent. The language barrier remains frustrating, though you're all getting better at the basic communications necessary for daily cooperation. You've learned to recognize words for common objects, actions, and concepts. More importantly, you've learned to read facial expressions, body language, and social cues that transcend specific vocabulary. You're developing a kind of intuitive understanding of when to approach someone with a request, when to offer help, and when to stay out of the way entirely. Virginia has adapted most quickly, as children always seem to do in these situations. She's picked up fragments of Croatoan language with the effortless facility that makes adults simultaneously envious and proud. She plays with local children using a combination of English words, Croatoan phrases, and the universal language of games that somehow transcends cultural boundaries. Watching her, you can see glimpses of what successful integration might look like, though you also realize it might take a generation to achieve. The practical challenges of establishing a new community have been complicated by the need to coordinate with existing residents who have their own established patterns, preferences, and priorities. You can't just clear land and build wherever seems convenient. You have to negotiate for space, for resources, and for permission to alter the landscape in ways that might affect other people. It's like trying to renovate a house while the original owners are still living in it and haven't entirely decided they want you as permanent housemates. Food sharing has become a complex social ritual that you're still learning to navigate properly. To contribute to communal meals, You must know what's available, how it's prepared, and who provides what, when, and how much. There are protocols around hunting, fishing, and gathering that seem to involve seasonal restrictions, territorial boundaries, and hierarchical privileges that nobody has explicitly explained to you, but which you're expected to somehow intuit. The most delicate negotiations have involved marriage customs and family structures. Several of your fellow colonists are single, and some have expressed interest in local partners, but the social rules governing such relationships are complicated and culturally specific. There have been a few tentative courtships, some successful and others less so, all of which have required careful diplomacy to avoid creating conflicts that could jeopardize the entire community's welcome. You've also had to confront the reality that some aspects of English colonial culture are simply incompatible with Croatoan social norms. Your assumptions about property ownership, individual autonomy and social hierarchy don't translate directly, and insisting on English ways of doing things would be both impractical and politically unwise. You're learning to be more flexible, more observant, and more willing to adapt your behaviour to fit circumstances, rather than expecting them to accommodate your preferences. But the strangest part of this integration process is the gradual realisation that you're not just learning to live with different people, you're becoming different people yourselves. The stress of relocation, the challenge of cultural adaptation, and the daily necessity of cooperation have changed how you think, how you solve problems, how you relate to each other, and how you relate to the environment. You've developed new skills, new perspectives, and new priorities. Things that seemed critically important back in the original settlement, maintaining English customs, preserving European social distinctions, and planning for eventual return to civilization, have faded in significance. What matters now is immediate survival, successful cooperation, and the gradual construction of a hybrid community that draws from multiple cultural traditions without being entirely constrained by any of them. Late at night, lying in your temporary shelter listening to unfamiliar sounds and familiar voices, you sometimes wonder if the person you're becoming would be recognizable to the person who first arrived in the new world. You've traveled not just geographically, but also culturally, linguistically, and perhaps even psychologically. You're becoming someone new, someone who exists in the spaces between established identities. And Virginia, growing up in this hybrid world, will be something entirely unprecedented, a person who belongs fully to neither English nor Croatoan culture, but to both simultaneously. Years pass, and you gradually stop thinking of yourself as English colonists temporarily residing among the Croatoan people. The distinction has blurred beyond recognition through daily cooperation, intermarriage, shared hardships, and the simple passage of time. Children born here, including Virginia, now a young woman who speaks Croatoan as fluently as English, belong to this place in ways that the original settlers never quite managed. You've become part of the community's seasonal rhythms, participating in ceremonies and traditions that would have seemed foreign and possibly threatening when you first arrived. You've learned to make tools, clothing, and medicines using local materials and traditional techniques. More importantly, you've learned to think like someone whose survival depends on intimate knowledge of local conditions rather than imported solutions. The original English settlement feels like something that happened to different people in a different lifetime. When you occasionally think about John White, or wonder whether any ships ever return to look for you, it's with the detached curiosity you might feel about historical events that don't directly affect your current life. The emotional urgency of rescue has faded, replaced by the more immediate concerns of the community you've actually built. But lately, you've been having conversations, quiet, private conversations, about visibility and invisibility, about what it means to vanish from one world while becoming part of another. Some of the older colonists are concerned about the stories people will tell about your disappearance and the assumptions they will make about your fate. The idea that people who never knew the truth might interpret your successful adaptation as failure or tragedy is unsettling. Virginia has started asking questions about her origins, about the English grandfather she never met, and about the difference between the family she was born into and the family she's grown up with. Her questions stem not from dissatisfaction with her current life, but rather from the innate human curiosity about identity and belonging. She wants to understand not just who she is, but how she came to be who she is. These conversations have made you realize that you've become custodians of a story that will probably never be told accurately. The people who might someday investigate your disappearance will have access to the carved messages you left behind, but they won't have access to the complex social, political, and personal factors that made relocation necessary and integration possible. They'll find mystery where you experienced practical problem-solving. You've also realized that the very success of your adaptation makes your story less visible to outside observers. If you'd all died dramatically, there might be obvious evidence: bones, abandoned belongings, signs of conflict or disaster. If you'd maintained a separate English community, there might be recognizable cultural artifacts, architectural remains, or other traces that clearly indicated European presence. But by integrating successfully, you've essentially disappeared into the existing cultural landscape. Your children and grandchildren will carry forward fragments of English language, customs, and knowledge, but these will be woven into a larger cultural fabric that wouldn't necessarily be recognized as having European origins. A few words, some techniques for working with metal or preserving food, and stories about places across the ocean might persist for generations without anyone recognizing them as evidence of the lost colony's fate. Sometimes, lying awake in the quiet hours before dawn, you imagine future historians puzzling over your disappearance. They'll have theories: disease, massacre, starvation, failed attempt to return to England. They'll analyze the carved messages, search for archaeological evidence, create elaborate explanations for what seems to them like an inexplicable vanishing. They'll never consider the most mundane and most profound possibility: that you simply became part of something larger than yourselves. The irony is that your story isn't really mysterious at all, at least not from the inside. You made rational decisions based on available information and circumstances. You adapted to survive, cooperated to thrive, and integrated because separation was neither practical nor desirable. You became invisible to history precisely because you became visible to your neighbours, accepted by your community, and successful in ways that don't leave obvious traces for future archaeologists to discover. But you understand now that mystery isn't always about what's unknown. Sometimes it's about what's unknowable from the outside, what can only be understood through lived experience rather than historical investigation. You've become part of a story that can't be solved like a puzzle because it was never broken in the first place. As you drift towards sleep, lulled by familiar sounds from a world that's become truly home, you find yourself hoping that somewhere, somehow, the people who wonder about your fate will eventually realize that the best possible ending to any story about lost colonists is that they were never really lost at all. They just found something better than what they were looking for.